What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, and as of about 24 hours ago, a Grandmaster support player in solo queue. Patch 14.5 is coming to a server near you, or is already live in a server near you. By the time you're watching this video, let's talk about what's in the patch, what's not in the patch, why we've done it, why we haven't done it. Let's go. A lot of cool stuff to talk about here. So, a lot of champion changes, right? As well as a decent number of systems changes here as well. There's some large-scale updates to Seraphine, some post-launch support to Smolder. Let's go ahead and talk about it. First up is a nerf to Bel'Veth. So actually, before we get to champion changes, I actually want to scroll down. I remind us what's going to do this. I want to talk about systems changes that are in this patch first, because they affect the game as a whole. And to me, that is valuable to bring up because that's more important than any individual champion change in general. So first off is an investigation into support items. Ultimately, there's plenty of items that we think are going to be hard bound to champions no matter what. So for example, the vast majority of enchanters are going to go Dreammaker. The vast majority of mage supports are going to go Zazax. There are some champions where you can go either way. You have a champion like Janna, where she builds AP, but also has enchanter outputs. You have champions like Sona, who have enchanter outputs, but they also auto-attack as part of the core combat pattern, and they have low enough cooldowns that a Sheen passive would totally make sense. You have an item like Celestial Opposition, which theoretically any champion can use, because any champion wouldn't mind some level of burst durability. And you have Solstice Slay that can obviously work well for a tank, but can also work for an enchanter who has a reliable crowd control output. And so measuring how all these items perform, now that we've had about a month and a half for players to identify what they want to use, what people think is strong, we can identify trends based on MMR and see if high elo players think differently than low elo players, and what is performing better than other options. As the dust has somewhat settled, and we've already done some reshaping of pushing some items toward late game, which we think is correct for the game, it has become apparent that Celestial Opposition is inferior to Solstice Slay on functionally every single tank champion. Our goals for Celestial are that it should be somewhat niche because every single champion can run it. If it ever dominates any other individual option, it just becomes the default choice that is also the generic choice, and that's not great. The fact that any champ can fall back to Celestial if they're doing poorly makes sense that this item exists and is meant to not be a trap. But if you're looking at any generic frontline tank, you look at a Rel or a Nautilus or a Leona or an Alistar, any of these champions, it should be realistic that Celestial is competitive with Solstice Slay. From my investigation, the win rate delta between Celestial Opposition and Solstice Slay is between 2 and 6% based on what champ you're playing. What's interesting is this is actually a very small contributor to Maokai's very high win rate, is that for all of these tanks, Celestial is worse than Solstice Slay, but Maokai has the highest pick rate of Solstice of any support tank. Despite the fact that every support tank should always go Solstice, Maokai players are the ones actually buying the correct item or upgrading the correct item more often. Maokai is still overpowered. We are nerfing him this patch, but it's worth noting that any Celestial Opposition versus Solstice Slay reshape disproportionately affects Maokai in particular. That's just something that's interesting that I found from my research here. But in general, if you are going 50-50, which a champion like Leona tends to go 50-50, that trading power here will tend to be fairly win rate neutral, sometimes win rate positive based on what people are picking. Anyway, so the goal is that Celestial is not the best default choice for the vast majority of champions. It's probably okay if a couple of champions have Celestial as their best default option, and they can opt out occasionally based on what's going on here, but we want the item to not be a trap. So essentially, we are targeting tank-specific buffs in general, because we really would rather this not be a default purchase on like Janna, Soraka, Sona, Nami, Zyra, Brand. Like, if those champs are going Celestial default, that's actually pretty bad for the game. If they go Celestial as fallback because they're getting slammed by a Zed or something, that's understandable. So, expect to see some win rate deltas here. That's going to be okay. Anyway, the primary buffs here are specifically melee champion skewed. This CC doesn't matter when Fizz or Zed or Qiyana jumps on you. This does matter when you're Thresh diving in, trying to take a big combo, and then you land, really good CC on the tail end when the shield breaks. The cooldown here is very, very little. This is not meant to carry a whole lot of power. This thing refreshes out of combat anyway. It's functionally just always going to be up once per fight, and that's it. This doesn't really bias one way or the other. This is a way to add a little bit extra power in a very, very small way, but this ends up lining up reasonably well with other effects that are kind of similar. If you look at flat damage shields like Malphite and Galio, those cooldowns are shorter. If you look at spell shields like Banshees and Edge of Night, those cooldowns are longer. This cooldown is still shorter than the old Crown of the Shattered Queen from last season. Regardless, again, it refreshes when you're in combat. You get it once per fight. You get it for, I think it's 2 seconds is how long the damage reduction lasts. Like, all that is reasonable. Anyway, it's meant to be a pretty light buff. Tank skewed buff, because right now it is a trap on most tanks from what we can tell win rate wise, and so raising it up somewhat. That is going, I'm going to skip over this for a second, that is going in line with Solstice Light getting nerfed here. So this item seemed to be overperformant last patch, and it's definitely overperformant in this patch as well. So it is a strict nerf to the cooldown, it is a strict nerf to the bonus move speed the item gives. Then there's a secondary change, which is shifting the amount of bonus health this item grants. Now, the old version of Slay from the previous patch was a flat 120. We'll get into the numbers in a little bit here for what those breakpoints actually mean, but it is basically shifting from being tank skewed to being neutral. This means that, again, we'll pick the most common purchaser of Solstice Slay, which is Maokai. Maokai's most common first item has 200 health on it. His most common rune page is double scaling health on it as well. And so it was very easy for Maokai to have more than enough health to make Solstice Slay functionally a buff. What this means basically is that this change is a direct nerf to tank supports and fairly close to power neutral on enchanters, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the numbers here. But basically, Solstice Slay is getting nerfed, and is getting nerfed. The goal here is about 2% win rate off of Solstice Slay. It's meant to be about 1% win rate positive on Celestial, and we are looking for relatively neutral to maybe 0.5, maybe at the very high end of what we're okay with, 1% positive win rate to Dreammaker, which is also shifting it from a flat value to scaling. In general, the way supports work right now is they complete their one item at around 14 minutes into the game, which is upgrading to Dreammaker, upgrading to Solstice Slay, upgrading to whatever. And that is a fairly meaningful power spike because you now have 200 bonus health, you have a bunch of extra mana regen and health regen, which matters some, right? It's some amount of power. And you got it for the upfront cost of 400 gold to buy your starting item, right? But that also comes with a big effect, a big passive like Dreammaker or Slay or Celestial or whatever. That comes online only about 2 minutes before your first finished legendary comes on as well. And even in those 2 minutes, you've still got, a full Chain Vest and a full Winged Moonplate, or, you've got the Band of Glass Mirror plus Fiendish Codex, and you're, almost ready to upgrade to Imperial Mandate or whatever. So in a lot of these cases, you're already at functionally one real item because you have all the components of one and then the unique passive of another, and then you finish your Echoes of Helia or your Moonstone or whatever, and now you're kind of on 2 items. And so it felt like supports were spiking too early. And not all of it was offense, but it felt like supports were spiking too early and kind of taking over the game for a bit at around 15 minutes. And so the goal with this, as well as some of the changes we did in the previous patch, was to shift out their power curves, slow them down, stretch them out, and make you have to care more about levels and push that value toward late game. Some of this is because at the end of the game, you still have an item slot locked in as your Wardstone, whereas other champions just have just Luden's Tempest, and you've got Luden's Tempest and a Zazax. You're more powerful than them at one item, right? But late game, when the mid laner has actually 6 full slots, you've got 5 full slots, and one of your slots is a Dreammaker or a Zazax or whatever. And so having an item like this have some level scaling says that, well, when you finally do get to full build, this item is somewhat carrying its weight in slot efficiency, and is not as much of a power spike when you first buy the item, which I think both of which are good changes. And so let's talk about the numbers for Dreammaker, Celestial Opposition, and Solstice Slay. Flashbang warning. Let's get into it. Okay, so here is the Dreammaker breakpoints. This is the damage block. This is the bonus damage dealing side of it. The break even here is around level 10, level 11. The theory here is that enchanters typically spend a lot of time in lane, and so they spend a lot of time actually absorbing XP and actually getting a decent amount of experience. So if you consider that you really probably get this item around level 8, I think that is actually a more realistic level timing. But if you are in a world where you are only ever in champion combat and you get your quest completion really, really early and you're really, really low level, technically the level scaling only starts at level 6. So if you get really, really far ahead of the curve, congratulations, there is a pretty... There is a floor down there at level 6 in case you get really, really, really ahead of the curve. Again, this is very, very unlikely, but I like to put the level scaling breakpoints at the optimistic level timing in 10% of cases or whatever, and for the most part, you actually come in partway through. I usually ballpark starting a support item at around level 8. That's from my experience playing what feels like around, level 7, level 8 feels like about when my items get completed. That's what it felt like, but I haven't actually looked and written it down, but that's just my feelings here. And so pretty quickly here on an enchanter, on a range support, you are pretty quickly getting into the part where it's, neutral-ish on 10, but then it's, buffed from 11 onwards. And yeah, level 18 is fake, don't get me wrong. And so part of the reason there's really, really aggressive level scaling here is, most supports are actually playing the 7 through 14 case, where it's going from 90 to 190. It's roughly doubling, right? 60 to around 130. It's roughly doubling. And to me, that was a fairly appropriate amount of scaling to get the item. That from when it first combines to when the item is done, it roughly goes double power, to me was the right shape. And then you can technically go 3x if you really go all the way to level 18, which is unrealistic and not expected. But this is the courtesy levels for when your game goes 45 minutes and you get a level 17 support, which is, again, quite unrealistic. For Solstice Slay, this is the data table for if you are playing Maokai. Again, if you complete it really, really early, it's heavily, heavily nerfed, but if you're getting it level 8, it's not so bad. This is Maokai with specifically 200 bonus health. This is assuming you have Winged Moonplate already by the time you finish the item. This is... Sorry, my brain blanked. This is double stat shards here, so it's very easy to do the level scaling here, but somewhere around here you finish the item and you're getting about 1/3 less health than before. This plateaus as time goes on. Maokai, one of certain items is Frozen Heart, so you're not going to go quite so aggressive here on the old percent health scaling, but again, it is a meaningful direct nerf to Solstice Slay, as well as the fact that the move speed goes down, as well as the fact that the cooldown is longer. So any given tank support is going to have a curve somewhat like this in terms of Slay giving meaningfully less health on a meaningful longer cooldown and a little bit less move speed there as well. Goal is about -2% win rate. If you're taking a champ with very, very little bonus health on them, like Janna, this item was still actually slightly overpowered on them as well from the data that I saw, but it's, of course, less aggressive here. If you're looking at very standard Imperial Mandate Shirelia's type Janna builds, where you have no bonus health pretty much anywhere but in your stat shards, it's not very different here. Again, the cooldown nerf still exists. The amount of health actually given still exists. It's still a small nerf there. The move speed given, still a small nerf here, but it is less of a nerf for an enchanter support than it is for a tank support. If we overshoot, we can easily add 5, 10, 15 flat health to Solstice Slay. We can easily walk back some of the move speed nerfs, right? Not a problem to retune these, but essentially this item is overpowered. Let's bring it down to the right level of power. That's the goal here. We think we're in roughly the right place. So we can really quickly talk about the fact that there's some other item changes as well. First up is a Frozen Heart nerf. 2500 is the, I guess I'll call it greedy tank support price point. This is where Trailblazer is, for example, but more default support tank items like Knight's Vow and Locket and Zeke's are 2300. So this is the, hey, you're reaching for this. It's priced to also be purchased for default laners, a Scion in the top lane or a Rel in the jungle or whatever. So it's, a midpoint between full tank items like Sunfire Cape and Jackshow and truly support tank items like, again, Knight's Vow and whatnot. So this is, I think, a reasonable price point to put Frozen Heart at. And ultimately, taking a just strict nerf of 100 gold off the price point, 100 gold worth of armor off the item, Frozen Heart is still 65 armor plus Cold Steel, I always get the name wrong, Rock Solid, and a % attack speed reduction aura. So Frozen Heart already is a multiplicative armor item. It also is kind of an aura item, so the idea that it can be support item, again, relatively low price point, still reasonable for that one. But ultimately saying that, yes, the goal here is that since this item is kind of a multiplier, there's value in this item being less self-sufficient and waiting a little bit more for you to finish other items, your Heartsteel, your Sunfire Cape, whatever it is, before you buy this item, to then have the multiplicative aspects of Rock Solid and of the attack speed reduction matter once you're further along into your build, and so the baseline self-sufficiency of this item by itself going down. As it stands right now, Frozen Heart is the single most built tank item in League of Legends. That seems too broad for what's meant to be a fairly niche idea. The other point here is that this is a very, very light, to be clear, buff to conventional marksman, because if Frozen Heart is less likely, if you're auto attack centric as a champion, I mean, this also affects Jax, to be fair, that if you're less likely to run into Frozen Heart, then you are going to be stronger as an attack speed focused champion overall. This is light touch. This is not meant to solve the complaints that we've been seeing around AD carry play, but a nudge in the right direction all the same. There's a buff to Heartsteel. This item does not have many users, and those who buy it still don't do very well on it. This item is ultimately just a little bit weak. The math here, I believe, says after 2 procs, the damage is simply better. But I think this item, I forget how much health the item gives, but essentially the math says after your 2nd proc, this item is just better than before. And just says, yeah, that the scaling of Heartsteel, the impact of the passive of Heartsteel goes up, is better. Congratulations. Spear of Shojin, these all actually went into the patch last time around, but stacks per cast gets flattened out, attack-based cast spells now work, and passives no longer count towards Focused Will. Okay, great. Sunfire Aegis, ultimately, just too weak of an item. The power level between Balmy Cinder and Sunfire Aegis is really, honestly, just too small right now. Right now on PvE, there are some light Balmy's Cinder nerfs in 14.6 that we will probably keep here as well. But regardless, Sunfire Aegis got nerfed when everything got demoted from being mythics. Sunfire was already a pretty strong item, even though it was a legendary. Didn't really need the nerf. This is bringing basically all the nerfs back. The 50 base health goes back up. The Immolate base damage goes back up by 3. So it's just back to the old Sunfire. This means a lot of laning tanks should feel a whole lot better. We've actually noticed that a lot of default laning top lane tanks look kind of bad right now. Some of this is they sort of rely on Sunfire to be a good item, and upgrading it is kind of a trap because you get most of the power just off Balmy Cinder, so this should be helpful. Now, this does mean that the total damage of tanks goes up, so the ability for a top lane Maokai to duel your Jhin is higher because Sunfire is a meaningful damage item. That is still going to be true, and it's going to be more true now, but I think that's, fairly reasonable at this point in time. I think it's going to be kind of okay. Either way, that's going on here. Next is a suite of tweaks to AP assassin items. There is a nerf to Lichbane, a buff to Storm Surge, and a buff to Hextech Rocket Belt. What it comes down to is there's a set of champions that are just Hextech Rocket Belt users because they are Galio, they are Fiddlesticks, they are Kennen, they are Nico. They just want the dash because it fits their kit. Okay, they're going to Rocket Belt, and we're not going to pay attention to them other than the fact that, yep, they buy Rocket Belt. That makes sense. That's an item you're going to buy. Okay, sure. Moving on. There's also a suite of champions, which off of memory is like Echo, Diana, Nidalee, not so much Evelynn, but there's a couple of other, I think Elise, but there's a suite of AP assassins where Lichbane and Rocket Belt would theoretically be in competition for your first item. And as elo goes up, pick rate of Rocket Belt goes down, and pick rate of Lichbane goes up, which means for the second set of champions, which are meant to be somewhat ambivalent between Lichbane and Rocket Belt, good players have identified that Rocket Belt, no contest, is not the option for it. And so this means that these items are not at the appropriate power levels. So Rocket Belt gets half-priced 10 ability power for only 100 gold. Lichbane loses 5% AP ratio off of the Spellblade passive. Right now, Lichbane is functionally grandfathered in as the highest proc damage item in the game. To be fair, this is the only thing the unique passive does. There is no other rider on it, compared to Storm Surge, where it sometimes gives you gold, it sometimes deals damage in an AoE, it gives you some move speed, right? Like, if you're comparing item to item, it makes sense that the total throughput of Lichbane would be higher than the total throughput of Storm Surge on a, total game item damage perspective. But also, Lichbane, of course, just does a whole lot of damage. The nice thing is, because Storm Surge has a much higher base, Lichbane doesn't always outcompete it in terms of damage per trigger. A lot of stuff going on here, there's a lot of math, but ultimately Lichbane is seemingly very clearly overperformant, and so 5% AP ratio off is not a big hit, but it's just meant to be a nudge. Lichbane is not wildly overpowered, it's just a little overpowered. And then we're at a case here where Storm Surge, we think that Storm Surge is the ceiling of what we are allowed to give a item proc right now in League of Legends. This might mean we at some point lower the cooldown of Storm Surge, we can raise the stat efficiency or something, but ultimately we don't want the burst from an item effect to be any higher than what Storm Surge is right now. As I mentioned, Lichbane is kind of grandfathered in. And so the goal is to say, well, what can we give Storm Surge that isn't just raw damage? This move speed buff actually now ties the move speed of Lichbane, so that is at least something there. This is a decent amount of move speed, right? This is 10 flat move speed functionally, a little bit more than that for most champions, so it does matter here, right? This is like, if you are most conventional champions, 10 flat move speed is almost 2% win rate. Now, this is 2% win rate of move speed that comes in after 15 minutes in the game if you buy it first, or 22 minutes in the game if you buy it second. That is obviously not going to be that much win rate at that point in time. But if you do care about move speed, Storm Surge is now the best move speed mage item, arguably, because the flat move speed on the item is very high, as well as the Storm Surge proc itself giving more. I'm not saying this item is going to be suddenly sick, but honestly, the fact that Storm Surge was the most built item in the game, despite being a burst stick, it is correct for this item to not be default. It is good for this item to be viable on assassins, and we will work to make sure that is indeed true, but there's plenty of other good options for your typical ranged mages who can go for other plenty strong options, and it's okay if Storm Surge is primarily a melee assassin item. So that is the set of systems changes, right? Tweaks to AAP assassins, a buff to tanks via Sunfire Cape, a very, very light buff to auto hackers via Frozen Heart, and then a very, very light buff to enchanters via Dreammaker, and then a reshape of power for Celestial Opposition and Solstice Slay towards making one of these items not a trap and the one not overpowered. Now let's finally go into the individual champion changes themselves. So we have a nerf here for Bel'Veth. She is being nerfed because of basically elite level solo queue, win rate and ban rate. She is a very, very strong performer in ultra high elos and is like, I don't know, like I think top 5 champions in Masters Plus right now. So definitely very, very strong. She was a big winner, which we knew was going to happen from the Kraken Slayer reshape from a couple of patches ago to shift it away from gold scaling into level scaling. Junglers get decent amount of XP, and Bel'Veth doesn't always buy a ton of flat AD bonuses, so she really liked the shape of this. It makes total sense. That's what happened here, and so it's not a big surprise. Ultimately, we're going after one of her more elite skewed tools in Royal Maelstrom, in the damage reduction here in the E. There is a risk that if we go too hard here, she has to build Bruiser. Right now, though, her core build is Kraken Slayer into Stridebreaker as the very clearly dominant 1-2, and then you often see Wit's End and Terminus and items like this. This build to me makes complete sense. These are the kind of tools that I would expect Bel'Veth to want. And the fact that only one of her, and the fact that basically all these items are largely damage focused is very reasonable for Bel'Veth. Like the on-hit space intentionally has durability in it. When you look at Wit's End, you look at Terminus and whatnot, you know, even Blade of the Rune King has lifesteal on it. That space is meant to be like 3 to 4 parts damage, 1 part durability. And so the fact that Bel'Veth is building 3 parts damage, 1 part's durability, most of her items makes complete sense and is the kind of build we want for Bel'Veth. So if she goes all the way towards Sterix Gauge Titanic Hydra, then we've gone too far in terms of her needing to buy durability to function. And so we'll keep this in mind if she has to go all the way, you know, to that kind of a tanky build. We don't think it's going to be the case, but regardless, what we think is an elite skewed nerf here to the champion, as well as getting 1 less stack of her passive per kill on Rift Herald and Void Grub. So up to 7 passive stacks were available if you got the perfect Grub Dub and you got Herald. That wasn't always the case, but of course she really wanted to kill these camps to get her ulti form, so it can happen sometimes. Anyway, let's go ahead and tab over Flashbang Warning again for the math on Bel'Veth. So, oh, I forgot, sorry. Before we talk about Bel'Veth, I did the math on what the Lichbane nerf actually meant. So Evelynn and Nidalee are the 2 highest pick rate Lichbane users, highest Lichbane pick rate champions in the game. In the case of Evelynn, we don't expect her to get off the item at all. In the case of Nidalee, Rocket Belt is a competitive option for high elo players who are good at using active items. So Evelynn is a little bit unique because her core build is Mejai's Death Cap, and so she has very, very high invincibility power. And so this is the expected item proc damage of Lichbane at item 1 through item 4, which is, I believe it's Shadow Flame 4th or something, I think. Or no, it's Void Staff 4th after Mejai's Death Cap, and I picked 10 Mejai stacks as the, like, just default point that we're at here. That might not be accurate, but whatever, she's a high AP user. And you can see that, you know, at Lichbane by itself, it's 4% less damage on the proc. As you go towards more and more items, it's up to 8% less damage on the proc. If you get all the way to 5 items and Gathering Storm stacks and Infernal Drake stacks and Mejai's goes 25, then obviously this number is even higher, but like, hey, the unique passive is down by about 5 to 6% on the item. Okay, great. In the case of Nidalee, Nidalee doesn't build quite as aggressively into ability power. She doesn't go Death Cap in most of her builds. She doesn't go Mejai's most of her builds. The amount of AP she gets a little bit lower. And so it is a very lightly less of a nerf here, but ultimately Nidalee is getting nerfed via the item as well as herself. But again, not a huge input here. And also, again, if you are good at using active items, Rocket Belt is a completely viable replacement, and she should be fine, especially in the hands of strong players. So shouldn't be a big issue there. In the case of Evelynn, she is getting nerfed during this patch as well. So we'll talk about that when it comes down to it. Okay, so let's talk about Bel'Veth. So one thing that is interesting about damage reduction is there are simultaneously 2 ways to think about it. So you can think about damage reduction as functionally a shield, right? If I'm going to die from full health to dead, but for 4 seconds I'm channeling my E, and then I keep dying for the next 4 seconds, then I eventually die, what this is functionally a shield. I am blocking some percent of damage, and the amount of damage it's getting blocked is being reduced by 17, 18, 20, 21%. And so in a case where you are using E for partial mitigation, and then E ends, then you keep dying, and then you eventually get killed, or you are using E just to parry a chunk of damage, you're going to parry 2 Baron attacks, or you're going to parry a Veigar ultimate or something, it's going to parry 17 to 21% less damage, right? And as a tool, it is that much weaker by taking 7% to 15% DR off the spell. Another way of thinking of it is I am pressing this button, and I'm going to die during my E. How much longer am I going to live if I'm dying only during the DR? It's not a damage blocker. It is a liver. Like, it's a live thing. And the example here would be like, if this was ever 100% DR, it's on for 2 seconds and stops, says, well, between 100 and 50 DR, it's just half as good. I block half as much damage. Because instead of blocking half the Veigar ult, I block all the Veigar ult, but then E ends, and then I can still be killed. The other way is, if it's full to dead, 100% DR means I'm literally immortal, and I no longer can die. You can't divide by 0, undefined infinity, right? Whereas, so basically what it means, though, is in this case, if you are literally going to die during your E, here's the other way of calculating how valuable this DR change is. Which is interesting, because if we look at it up here, and you're like, well, as a damage blocking tool, it's about 20% weaker, full stop. It's just a 20% weaker damage blocking tool. But if I'm using it to literally not die and live for as long as possible, but I'm going to die during this anyway, it is 10% worse than that in the early game, but actually 33% worse than that in the late game. In terms of like, you're going to kill me during the E, I don't have a way around this, so I'm just going to live as longer as possible. I live 1/3 less longer. Right, is a much worse tool for that. Like, that's, I think, interesting analysis and one that's worth doing. And I want to bring it up as the 2 ways to think about this tool overall. But hey, it's, about 20% weaker as a defensive tool. Okay, fine. Next is Brand. I saw some confusion over the logic behind the Brand changes. Ultimately, what it is Brand is a roughly 54% win rate, low elo, mid laner, and support. And that breaks the thresholds of our win rate oracle. And we elected to skip him in the previous patch. Like, we had the discussion and said, now we'll leave him there for a patch. But ultimately, unless there's a really compelling reason why you wouldn't nerf someone out of 54% win rate, we chose to nerf Brand out of 54% win rate. Now, the goal here is meant to be fairly light. It's to put him, honestly, around 53. At the end of the day, Brand is an easy-to-play champion. He has one of the lowest required, mastery curves in the game. And so any champion like that is going to be very performant in a matchmaking bracket where players are less experienced at League of Legends. They have less practice on their average champion. A rule of thumb is that the median number of games of experience on a champ in a ranked game of League of Legends is 7. Now, it's going to be very different in, let's say, Masters. It's going to be different in Iron. But ultimately, 7 games of experience is the median amount of experience on a champion. When you think about the game like that, you're like, well, of course Brand is going to work really, really well in the lower MMR brackets where players have maybe even fewer than 7 games on average on their champion. Like, when Brand plays against, Vel'Koz or Yasuo in mid, and everyone's got 7 games of XP, of course Brand's going to do better there. Like, of course, right? Malzahar's going to win more games, and Brand's going to win more games, and Kassadin is going to win fewer games because he's harder to play than these champions. Not that Kassadin's very difficult, but this is why you see high win rates on Garen and such in lower MMRs, because the playstyle is straightforward. That said, there was still a constraint on how much win rate we're willing to give a champion here, and that is 54%. And so we're nerfing Brand in specifically for low elo. And so what we're specifically targeting is late game, non-gold scaling, gained for free by just existing power, because those things tend to be explicitly low elo skewed. Low elo games go longer, low elo players are worse at farming gold directly, but they're really not that bad at sitting in lane and getting XP because you can't optimize much getting experience. And so experience gain is a very low elo skewed thing. There's another reason that Kayle, for example, is often low elo skewed, though not aggressively so, but there's still some there. All this to say that we are trying to take about 1% win rate off of Brand mid and Brand in the support role. We know that level skin is going to be more mid lane skewed than support skew, but it's still going to affect both versions to a decent amount. The final thing to say is that Brand jungle in elite MMR bracket, so like about 0.5%, which is roughly Masters Plus, is he is a 50% win rate jungler. Now, if you are in, let's say, the Emerald to Diamond bracket, he is like a 51% win rate jungler, which is lower than his top and support win rate, which are like 53, I think, in those brackets. And then if you are in Platinum and below, he is a 52% win rate jungler, where, again, Brand is 54 in mid and support. So essentially, in every MMR bracket, Brand is either perfectly balanced at 50% as a jungler, or worse in performance than his top or support, or sorry, his mid or support performance. So to me, this seems that, okay, well, Brand as a jungler has a real play rate. So currently, Brand's jungle play rate is equivalent to champions like Nocturne and Zac and like a lot of like moderately popular junglers. Like, Brand has a real audience of players who like playing Brand. The fact that there is a real audience who likes playing Brand means that we are going to intentionally support Brand jungle as a primary, not the primary, a primary audience for Brand. There is a very large support audience that is not going to go away. That is his primary audience. And then Brand jungle has a large audience as well, and that is his basically second primary audience. Even in lower MMRs, Brand mid only has about 10% of his total play rate. If we can support it, we will, and for now it's completely fine, so there's no urge here. But Brand mid is a relevant play rate for a decent portion of our players. He's still relatively popular in mid lane. I think it's over a 2% pick rate in mid, is really not that bad. In lower MMRs, it's above champions like Annie and Ryze last I checked. Regardless, right, this champion clearly exists, clearly has an audience, and ultimately, if you're someone who says that Brand is a broken, overpowered jungler, you're just not up to date. There was a time where he was broken overpowered in 14.2, and that was true. In parts of 14.3, he was also really broken. That's no longer the case, though. He is pretty strong. He's also very easy to play, which means a lot of players will perform on him without a lot of practice because he's easy to play. And, that's acceptable. That's totally fine. Brand has an audience, and that's awesome. So let's talk about the math here in terms of what this means for Brand. I didn't do the math on the passive damage because the math is very obvious. It's about 10% more damage to jungle monsters. No big deal. But here is the amount of damage that we expect to come out of Brand R before and after the changes, accounting for about how much AP he normally buys in the support role. It's about 10% less damage in the 11 through 15 area, and still about 15% less damage, or 14% less damage in the 16 through 18 area. As far as the cooldown, 5, 11, 20% longer cooldown. This is still a more than reasonable ulti cooldown. Honestly, we could have brought this up to 120 at rank 1 or something. That's still also a pretty reasonable ulti cooldown. But we ultimately wanted to go for parts of the kit that didn't require skill expression. So the parts that do require some skill expression, whether you're going to bounce your E or land your skill shots, or be more about crowd control, or set up the 3-stack passive, which requires more than just press button AFK. Wanted to leave those parts a bit more intact and take away some of the very easy, if you're having a bad game, it doesn't matter, you just press R and it's fine no matter what. Basically bringing down Brand's sort of excessive power level regardless of investment in the ultimate. We then go to an Evelynn nerf. Evelynn, much like Bel'Veth, is a huge win rate and, I'd say huge, a large ban rate and win rate problem in elite levels of solo queue. She is a quite high ban rate for her power level. She's also just quite high power level overall in this elo, and she's, a very, very bursty assassin. There were a couple things we looked at here. We had various looks at the ultimate. This could have been the base damage, could have been the execute, could have been the AP ratio. Ultimately, Evelynn has, I think, her AP ratios to me are too outsized. They're too high. The fact that she wants to go death cap over everything else is reasonable. That is fine. The fact she's building Magi's over everything else is a little bit too much over the line for me. That she scales too hard, a little bit too hard of ability power. I think it's fine that she always wants the 120 AP items, but it's just, to me, a little bit too high. And so I wanted to go after AP ratios pretty much no matter what. Now, one thing that's worth noting is that this spell triggers 4 times on your primary target, or 3 times in the AoE. This ratio is the most used AP ratio on the kit. The mark damage is only used 3 times. This part of the kit is used 4 times. And so this nerf is a 20% AP ratio nerf from, I believe, 1.95 to 1.75. So 10% of the total AP scaling of the spell has gone down. And the spell, you look at the AP ratio compared to the base damage, most of the spell's damage is in the AP ratio. So it's actually a very, very big deal. Also worth noting that not counting things like items and runes, which are of course kit agnostic, more than half of all of Evelynn's kit damage comes from her Q. Q is more than half of the damage that comes out of her button presses, and so any nerf to Q has a really, really large impact on the total output of this champion. More so than almost any other champ in the game, this is a very, very sort of skewed sort of input of where her damage is coming from. So a 10%, a 10% of the AP ratio going away on half of a champion's kit is a pretty big deal, right? So it's basically 5% of her entire kit's AP scaling is going down. Is kind of the way of viewing this, right? Not much else to say here. Let's talk about it. So this is looking at Evelynn's primary build. This is her single target damage, where she's getting the 3 hits of the mark as well as all forecasts of Q. Here's the AoE damage, where she's getting the AoE, just the 3 post casts on other champions, on other minions, on the other monster you're hitting, on whatever. And so you notice that the damage is, of course, late game skewed. It's gold skewed. So this is also going to be skewed towards you got your Magi stacks. This is skewed towards you got the snowball rolling. But it doesn't nerf you as badly if you get behind on Evelynn. So you are a little bit less feast or famine on this champion. which I think is reasonable for this champion. Overall, I think it's fine to have a slightly, well, not a higher floor, we're not buffing the floor, but like a lower ceiling here for an OP champ, I think is reasonable. And overall, right, you look at the damage here and you're like, okay, well, half of your kit is doing about 5% less damage. Okay, you're doing about 2 to 3% less damage as a champion. Okay, that means you're going to lose about 1.5% win rate, right? That's roughly how the math works. Evelynn is a damage first champion, and that is going to roughly line up as 1%-ish or so of win rate off Evelynn. It's also worth noting that the output of Q is elite skewed, that the relative portion of her power budget from Q is higher in elite MMR than lower MMR, so the Q nerf should be lightly elite skewed here. And so, yeah, this should be a pretty big deal overall, that this is going to be a pretty meaningful impact. Obviously, in some cases, she'll still overkill her primary target, but there's going to be some cases where she won't get you to the 30% threshold, and she won't overkill you with ult. And those are going to happen sometimes, and yeah, we'll see what happens. There's actually a real risk that this nerf is too high on Evelynn. We're, again, nerfing Lich Bane by 5% AP as well. That's also getting 10% of its AP ratio cut, right? So both Evelynn's Q and her Lich Bane, which she's buying first item, are losing 10% of their gold scaling. That is not a small matter, so we'll see what happens here. We are doing some buffs to Jarvan. Jarvan is another champion who is relatively easy to play. He is low MMR skewed. He is a very, very straightforward tank fighter jungler. We are okay with Jarvan being low elo skewed. He's great. He's a solid sort of introductory jungler. His combos make sense. His buttons are pretty easy to use. He just, yeah, is an appealing champion who's often quite popular when he's not weak. Because he is relatively easy to play, he's going to naturally, when balanced, have a fairly high win rate in lower MMRs. That's very reasonable. Then when you go off against, the Bel'Veth and Evelynn who require more mastery, it's going to look a little bit worse in elite MMRs because those players are just higher mastery on their champions compared to when you see them in lower MMRs, and the Bel'Veths are, their second time playing the champion sometimes, right? So anyway, this is an admittedly low elo skewed buff of some armor growth. I am a fan of giving a lot of these melee champions 5-something armor growth when they have very high MR growth, just natively by being melee. Having relatively higher armor growth says that, hey, natively as a class, these are champions who are good against lethality and flat pen. And when you acknowledge a champion like Annie or Ashe or whatever, I hear a lot of marksmen actually have very high armor growth natively, but I am a fan of armor and MR being somewhat in sync when there's not a reason to desync them, in the case that like Cassante and Rumble have had this for mid lane skew before. The other case here is a revert of a Dragon Strike nerf back when he was buying Spear of Shojin, the old Spear of Shojin, which had a ton of ability haste on it. He was simply getting too many Qs in fights. New Spear of Shojin is still an item that he likes quite a lot, but it doesn't bring his Q cooldown so short that it's comical. And so a simple revert on a change that no longer makes sense for the current landscape of the game. We can talk about the math here real quick. Without items, here is the physical durability of Jarvan before and after. It's a solid, once you get in a mid game, 2 to 3% more physical durability. Of course, if you get armor from other sources, you go Steel Caps, you go Death Stance, whatever, it's going to go down. As far as your Q cooldown from level 4 onwards, it's a better cooldown. Pretty nice stuff here. You're going to feel it pretty quickly on. Okay, cool stuff. Not much else to say. Buffs. Kayn. Red Kayn is in a pretty sorry state right now. Ultimately, Red Kayn is actually typically building assassin items and just sort of like, well, screw it, I'm just going to pick Red Kayn because that's what evolve I got, and we're just going to go Profane Hydra and Hubris and Opportunity and whatever. I'm just going to go build Lethality. And we would like if Red Kayn was building fighter items. And so we're very specifically playing up the unique aspects of Red Kayn, which is his ability to self-heal and the ability to self-heal. So this is a bonus health ratio on the Dark and bonus healing to ensure that this is a viable part of the kit, where if you buy a Sundered Sky and a Titanic Hydra or whatever, and Sterix Gauge and whatever else, Black Cleaver, that you're going to be rewarded with more healing. One difficulty with a lot of these champions is that because their healing is post-mitigation, any source of armor penetration is a healing increase, which, other than building Black Cleaver, often asks you to then just build lethality, because lethality is a healing increase. And so trying to combat that somewhat by saying, well, you can get more healing via lethality. You can also get more healing via buying some bonus health, which is functionally the opposite of lethality. Outside of, I think, literally Edge of Night, you can't get lethality and health in the same stat, in the same item. So this to me is the right lever to use. If we need to deliver this to someone like Aatrox, we can do that as well, of course, but I think this makes sense. We've been increasingly happy to use stat bindings to encourage sort of correct item purchases to make sure that their builds can be on fantasy, and that you're not just a healing assassin, you are a healing fighter, and that's the shape we want for this champion, and that it means that blue Kayn and red Kayn can be much more distinct. If your optimal red Kayn build is fighter items, you have a much more different version of the champion one way versus the other. And then a simple healing increase in Umbral Trust Class. The red Kayn R healing actually does not care about armor and MR. This is specifically 65% of the tooltip damage becomes 75% of the tooltip damage, so lethality actually does not scale your R healing whatsoever. So just raising this ratio, because all you have to do is increase base damages, right? Just buy more AD, this will go up. This doesn't need lethality to scale up, not a big problem. And in fact, the larger your health pool is, the more likely you are not to overheal with this R and ensure that all that healing doesn't go to waste. And so it also softly encourages you to build some health. So here is a look at Fighter Kayn's itemization. This is him trending from 0 items toward 4 items. I believe right now his most common fighter itemization is Sundered Sky, Cleaver, Sterix, and something else with health on it. The second most common build is Death Stance instead of that 4th item, but basically his most common build is 4 health items that have around 350 to 450 health on them. And yeah, as you trend towards 4 completed items, you have a solid 34% increased healing. If you ever go to item 6, or if you end up running towards Overgrowth for some reason, or you switch out a damage shard for a health shard, which I don't think you should ever do, then you would have even larger gains here. But generally speaking, yeah, just going to be the way this is. And also keep in mind, like, Red Kayn is not going to exist in the first 5 levels, so really your numbers are more like, let's say it's like level 8 or something, it's going to be somewhere around here. And, from the get-go, right? Like, you've got your Summoner's Guy about done, and you're in a pretty good spot, right? So the other change, though, is to the R. It's a flat 50% increase, because that's how the math of 75 or 65 works here. But in terms of attacking a mid-health target on your most common fighter build and the amount of bonus AD that is, here's the amount of healing coming out of the skill before and after. And yeah, a solid 500 point heal at, late rank 2 of the ultimate. To be fair, I don't think this has much to do with rank ups anyway, is, a solid amount of increase. And I'm going to ask you to have a slightly bigger health pool to use this. Next is Kog'Maw. Kog'Maw just is kind of sad. Now, the interesting thing is Kog'Maw is currently above 50% win rate. And despite that fact, Kog'Maw feels weak to both players playing him and his opponents when he is like sub 52. Whatever that's the case, we have champions like Taric who are also 52% win rate, and people think Taric might be the worst champ in the game. Win rate is not necessarily power. Win rate is not necessarily the feel of power. Win rate is just simply how this champ performed in terms of Nexus dying. Okay. At the end of the day, we're not balancing explicitly around win rate. We're balancing the game around player perception of power and player feels of playing League of Legends. League of Legends being a fun game is more important than League of Legends Champions having a 50% win rate, right? One of these is way more important than the other. So Kog'Maw's win rate is actually getting farther away from 50% win rate right now. The probably total fun of League of Legends, if Kog'Maw is not just shattered, is going up when Kog'Maw is in the rotation sometimes and is viable. We had held off on buffs for the last couple of patches because we had buffed Rageblade and then Terminus in back-to-back patches to put them in a decent spot, and we intentionally said, okay, let's wait. Let's see. How's Kog'Maw feeling? How's Kog'Maw doing? Kog'Maw's not doing all that well. He's historically been able to sustain a pretty high win rate, a roughly Taric tier win rate, without causing any alarm bells, and so we are once again seeing if Kog'Maw can have that win rate and feel fine. Now, the nice thing is we're doing largely feels based buffs here, so more move speed during the passive. The cast time of Q is getting significantly shorter, which is kind of nice. You can weave it in your combats a bit more easily. Your ability to kite's getting a bit better. You're gonna, drop partially, like a fraction of an auto less, 10 flat slow increase on Void Ooze, a bit of utility up for this champion as well. So if you are having a bad game, you've got a little bit more that you can do utility wise. And then Living Artillery getting a pretty small bump to the bonus AD ratio per hit here. Ultimately, the rank scaling on R is largely around the range. The gold scaling here is carrying a lot of this, to be honest, because the rank scaling is only plus 40. This is a pretty light touch, but it does do something. So here is the slow before and after. Not a big surprise. Again, it's just the flat 10% until level 14 plus. But to be fair, a 40% slow is actually a kind of meaningful slow. A 30% slow is kind of on the low end. And then looking at his most common bot lane builds, which is, again, I think it's Bork, Rageblade, Terminus, Hurricane, something around there. But it's like, there's only so much bonus AD and bonus AP in these builds. It's a pretty small increase to our damage. Just means that, hey, you're not in range to auto attack, but your artillery is that little bit better. This all multiplies against the low health multiplication that happens. So all this stuff seems pretty reasonable. All valid stuff here. Some touches up to Kog'Maw to say that, hey, the typical on-hit Kog'Maw build is not quite as reliant on just auto-attacking. The other pieces do a little bit more, and I think that's cool stuff. So it is time for round 3 of our Maokai nerfs. One thing I saw some confusion over was the suggestion that I was somehow keeping us from nerfing Maokai because I was playing him in solo queue. That's obviously wrong. how do I want to approach this topic? I didn't really think about like what I want to say here. I just knew I wanted to kind of talk about it briefly. We decide on what we want to do, and we suggest which champs we want to buff and nerf, what kind of systems things we want to do, what kind of champion tweaks for feel we want to do as a broad team, as a broad organization. Everyone in the League of Legends gameplay, like pillar, this is like champs team and modes and whatnot. Like, and there's like some really good players out there in modes, like GM players out there, who all have the space to be like, hey, I think this would be better for League of Legends. Like, I would like us to try this. So for example, the on-hit Azir Soldiers applying on hit came from a game modes designer because he wanted to use it for Arena to let on hit Azir be a thing, but that still went through the process of like, hey, I want to do this. It's going to affect the live game. What numbers make sense? What tuning makes sense? Like, let's put this in. And it's like, you know, empowered to make those changes and put it forward and all that made sense, right? So it's a very collaborative process in terms of everyone can pitch in and do some work here and have their thoughts made. We also collaboratively decide what kind of win rate magnitude we want to hit for our champions. At no point did we say, hey, folks, we got to nerf Maokai. Let's put him at 54% win rate, which is still above Oracle. Because people would have been like, that's a really bad target. You should nerf him below that point. It would have been like, you're right. He shouldn't be 54. The fact that Maokai is OP for one patch more than he was supposed to be means that we missed on the magnitude of our changes, not the goals of our changes. So the first thing, the first stuff we did back in point 3, was probably under mag, but it was like, hey, let's make changes that retain jungle and retain top lane because these roles have pick rate. They have more than 10% of Maokai's play rate is in these roles. Let's try version 1 of let's try really hard to nerf a bunch of support skewed outputs. Let's try to buff a bunch of top and jungle skewed outputs. We're going to switch, you know, the fact that you have to max E, so E costs more mana and has a longer cooldown if you don't max it, which supports never get the chance to. We're going to, you know, nerf a bunch of outputs in terms of we're going to nerf some early outputs here. We're going to, you know, return mana costs and cooldowns because junglers and top lane are going to use that more. And you know, it's like, yeah, people signed off on like what our goals were, on what the tactics were, and he was still overpowered. And so we said, okay, shoot. Maokai's still overpowered. Okay, for point 4, we're just going to nerf him. And we're going to nerf him, and we want to nerf him to like 52 and change. And he was, I think he was like almost 55, and we want to nerf him to like 52 and change. I think it was 54 and a half. I think it was 54 and a half, and it's like, we not get him to like, you know, we want to minus 2% on him, right? And so we went after a bunch of stuff. I forget what all it was, but we took out 4 armor, which should be more than 1% win rate normally. We took out 5 damage on Q. We did like one other thing. I forget what else it was, but, you know, went after Maokai reasonably hard. It's like, okay, we hope this will be around, you know, minus 2% win rate or something. And it wasn't, right? And part of that was we buffed Solstice Slay. That wasn't the intent. We looked over the changes and thought it wasn't going to be a direct buff to Solstice Slay, but it was a buff to Solstice Slay. And so it's like, oops, Maokai basically clawed 1% win rate back off of Solstice Slay being stronger because it's like the only support enemy buys. Oops. Okay, well, at no point did we say keep Maokai 54, but he ended up 54. Okay, well, let's try again. Obviously, it sucks to miss. It sucks to miss. We're, you know, sorry that it missed. But let's try again. Let's try to take down Maokai. So I actually ran math on the relative pick rates of Solstice Slay and Celestial Opposition for Maokai specifically, and our expected win rate magnitudes for Solstice Slay and Celestial Opposition. And that math suggests that if Maokai does not change his buying habits at all, that the item nerfs themselves will nerf Maokai by 1.3% win rate. So if the only changes we made to systems were to Maokai, he would go from 53.8 to 52.5. Now, to be fair, 52.5 was Maokai's win rate all of last year, and no one cared. That said, exercising a extreme amount of caution is that we might go under mag on Solstice Slay, and players might not be okay with 52% win rate Maokai now that the cat's out of the bag, and they're aware this champion is this strong. Okay, fine. Let's add another 1 to 1.5% win rate off of Maokai to put him from 52.5 to 51. And I think at 51 Maokai, hey, that's below Taric tier. That's below where he was all of last year. Our players accepting of 51% win rate Maokai. And if they're like seriously not okay with it, then we can go again. But this is meant to be a concerted effort to bring him down to a win rate that we think is more than reasonable for this champion. A somewhat defensive skewed tank like Taric or Braum, or in this case Maokai, tends to be fairly reasonable, and so we'll see. Anyway, 5 flat move speed off of Maokai. We know that, of course, this will affect any of his roles, but Maokai support roams very, very heavily. Maokai support is the only role that buys Swifties, which indicates to me that he cares more about move speed than his other stats. I've seen the take both internally and just from the internet that a base move speed change is not going to be support skewed. I believe it will be, based on his buying habits being very clearly outsized toward move speed purchases. The fact that he has such an appetite for it that he wants a stat above everything else. There are way more efficient ways to get tank stats than a Trailblazer. There's, okay, not better tank stats than Solstice Slay right now, sure, but his best rune pages run move speed, his best boots are Swifties, and it's like, if he cared about being tanky, he would go Merc Treads. If he cared about tanky, he would go Steel Cuts. If he cared about tanky, he would go Locket or Frozen Heart first instead. But basically everyone is going Slay, but that's just because it's correct. Basically everyone is going for Swifties, basically everyone's going Trailblazer, so this indicates that move speed is the core stat for support Maokai, and the fact that he has such an appetite means that this should be a bias stat for him compared to everything else. I mean, you think about like, hey, what's the best thing about support Maokai? Is it his damage? Compared to being a top laner or a jungler where dealing damage is literally how you lane or how you clear jungle, I doubt that. Is it how tanky you are? Well, no. In a jungler, you have to like gank and tower. I have to Sword Eater as well, but like, okay, fine. But you know, as a top laner, you have to lane against Darius. As support Maokai, you live in the river and then go gank Azir. So, you know, I think about all the things that Maokai actually does, and it's like, well, move speed and vision control are basically the two things that are really support skewed, and if this is still not enough, we probably go for saplings again, and that's probably reasonable, but that's kind of the thought process here. Anyway, the rest of it is a 1 second cooldown on Twisted Advance. From experience, I've played, I don't know, 60 games of Maokai so far this split, and the number of times you actually get a second W is pretty meaningful, actually. It's a really good tool for dodging CC. There's a pretty large number of times where you'll get a second W in a long trade. We have used this lever before with champions like Alistar, where the uptime of their CC matters. And I don't think this is quite as meaningful as Headbutt, because Headbutt has more reach, so you're more able to, you know, go for Headbutt on cooldown. But we still have, again, relatively similar targets here of here's a cooldown change on an engage button that's not the ulti, and, you know, it has moderate impact here. And ultimately, again, the goal for these changes are between 1.5% win rates, and combining this with the move speed change is probably going to get pretty close to that. And then plus also Slay means he's supposed to be 51 and change, right? This, though, is make good. Maokai's secondary audience is very, very clearly jungle. I am not a fan of killing him out of every role possible, and basically Maokai's jungle clear is on the slow end right now, and so went for a pretty aggressive first clear buff of 40 flat damage on the Q early game. That's a pretty big deal. It's going to give him one of the fastest clears he's had in a long time for his first clear, since the cooldown already got shorter a couple of patches ago, and this, of course, is 40 more flat damage here. Yeah, he's going to have a pretty decent clear first time around, and, you know, we expect Maokai to be a pretty decent jungler, we expect Maokai to be a pretty decent support, and hopefully this puts him in the right place. I believe we have math. Sorry about that. Flashbang. So here is the Q monster damage before and after. Yeah, it is a very, very solid 25% damage increase in the early game. Again, falls off at level 9. The W cooldown, 8 to 10% slower for most of the game. You're probably still going to max it 1 second as support, but hey, by the way, here's the changes. We move on to Nidalee. Nidalee, not much math to do here. Nidalee is a very, very strong performer. After the E buffs, we are actually very, very happy that she's... we're very, very happy that she's got a much better heal. She's got a fallback pattern. Our data indicates that those changes to Nidalee were quite low MMR skewed. So this raised the floor of what Nidalee can provide, so that if you're on your 7 games of XP on Nidalee, you've got something you can provide. So there's a thought in my head that I don't know how to reconcile, which is, on the one hand, it is totally reasonable to have Azir and Nidalee shaped champions where they require a lot of mastery and you're going to lose games until you get good. I think that's totally fine and acceptable, and that's not necessarily a problem in and of itself. The corollary to that, though, that I find kind of difficult is it does mean, though, that you're griefing your team while learning the champion. And we know that, like, the default win rate of Nidalee and Azir and all these champions in low MR is often quite low. The way I kind of view this, I guess, sort of ideally, is we should probably not lower the skill ceiling of a champion and just, like, we lowered your skill ceiling and gave you some base stats. Here you go. Your champ is now, you know, less elo skewed. Hooray. You know, I think that's not, it can be effective at doing that, but it can be incorrect unless the floor is really so low that this champ actually deserves to have a real floor. Like, I do think there are some champions whose floor is just simply too low. If your champion's base stats are just at astronomically low levels to where, like, your just basic right-click functionality is just kind of trash, then yeah, I think that is a floor that we are allowed to raise. In the case of Nidalee, all of her power was in her damage and none of it was in her vision control and utility aspects, okay, yeah, we should probably make her E a real skill. And hey, heals are pretty easy to use. Okay, sure. One of Nidalee's 6 core skills is normal power level and it's easy to use. That to me seems very fine and like the right thing to do. And again, it indeed had a low MMR skewed output because it's pretty easy to use her heal correctly compared to like pounce or takedown or whatever, right? Managing cougar form and, you know, dancing back and forth and understanding all that stuff. Again, not really trying to drop the ceiling very much, but happy to raise the floor in the case of low MMR play. Ultimately, these buffs ended up being too much a couple patches ago. And so we're nerfing Nidalee because of elite level MMR dominance. She's very, very strong. Weirdly, she's not very popular in NA. But like Nidalee is like literally the 2nd strongest champion in Masters Plus solo queue, and I just like don't see the Nidalee complaints on Reddit because Reddit is really NA skewed, and Nidalee's just like not popular in NA. It's weird. But she's like really popular in other regions, and yeah, she's like incredibly dominant, right? I just find that interesting that like there's very strange and interesting server biases that I've like started to look into more and more. I've been more curious about it, and Nidalee's one of them where like she's actually just less popular in NA. Regardless, all this to say, we're reverting some of our older buffs. The 5 base move speed no longer needs it. Ultimately, she still moves around pretty quick with pounce, and she has, again, pretty solid baseline stats with, you know, her E being reliable, so that one's getting reverted. And then, you know, a little bit of takedown damage. Q, as a total spell slot, ends up being more than half of all Nidalee's damage. That's not saying it's all takedown. Obviously, Javelin Toss is the only thing that deals damage in human form. Javelin Toss has a lot of her damage as well, don't get me wrong. But Q as a spell slot is a little bit elite skewed in damage output, actually. That high MR players tend to be just like they get more Q damage straight up. Now, in general, though, what's interesting, now, yeah, we actually don't have the data of takedown versus javelin toss. We have it on a per spell slot basis. We just haven't built a report out that's complex enough to take it by spell name. But essentially, this is to say that most skill shots tend to be low MMR skewed. So, for example, Brand E is his most high elo skewed damage skill. And then everything else is low elo skewed. And in the case of Nidalee, Q is a high elo skewed ability. When, of course, now very reasonable suggestions are that I don't know. I don't want to spend too much time here. Ultimately, it leads me to believe that takedown is a highly skewed skill. Technically, this does mean we're lowering the ceiling a little bit here because the ability to use Hunt correctly and finish targets correctly is going down a very small amount here. That's true. But I don't think this is something going to make Nidalee easy, and so to me this is palatable. Regardless, it is one of the 2 nerfs we want to put in for Nidalee to bring her down to a reasonable win rate, or a more reasonable win rate in really high MMRs. So the Rek'Sai update that landed last patch, unfortunately, landed well under magnitude for win rate, and there were some bugs there as well, which really sucked. But the nice thing is it gave us a lot of room to give Rek'Sai a lot more power. Ultimately, we as a team missed on how much win rate we thought and how much power we thought more and better tunnels were going to be. It ended up being not that much power, and so we took a lot of her damage out. We slowed some things down, and turns out that just really wasn't needed, and so we can give a lot of stuff back because we didn't need to buy the budget back. So we're putting a lot of power back into the kit. Let's go. So let's talk about, now I did a video a while back around the Rek'Sai updates from about a week ago, the version 2 updates here, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on it, but ultimately her basic attack is going to be a lot faster with its actual animation speed, and the spot in the animation is going to be much sooner, so you're going to have much faster between right click and damage applying. Very meaningfully so. This is getting applied to Queen's Wrath as well. The cast room is actually going to be even faster, so not only is your attack speed going to be increased because of just Q gets attack speed now, but also the frame is actually faster as well, so pretty meaningful stuff here. It's now going to work with Shojin against only 1 target. Cool stuff here. We're fixing the cancelable auto attacks that was fixed a different bug. We fixed the bug that this required. We are now going to do some functionality changes. Unburrow will always get all large monsters in range, not only if you right-click them. Unburrow will now always deal damage, even if they have the knock-up lockout here. So if you want, as part of your core Rek'Sai jungle pattern, to, you know, burrow, Prey Seeker, unburrow, deal damage for 4 seconds, burrow, unburrow, deal damage for 4 seconds, burrow, Prey Seeker, unburrow. You can do a burrow, unburrow loop as part of your jungle clear and get a little bit more speed out of it. Congratulations, you can press some buttons. there was a bug where occasionally Rek'Sai, if you were already auto-attacking and then burrowed and immediately right-clicked, you could sometimes get locked out of your auto-attack. It was really, really weird. This has been fixed now as well. The tunnel bug where you weren't getting over the wall should be less common, though I cannot guarantee a negative. I can't disprove a negative, so I can't guarantee the bug is entirely fixed, but it should be better than it was before. Furious Bite is getting its damage re-added, specifically in the early game. One thing that's happened with this update is Rek'Sai became a late game skewed champion. The goal was not to make her late game skewed, the goal was to give her a late game but not remove her early game priority, and so it's an early game skewed buff to Furious Bite and an early game skewed buff to the monster mod to have better jungle clear. Rek'Sai's most common jungle path is still a 3-camp clear. This actually might not be enough, but I would like I don't want to force Rek'Sai to not do early ganks, but I would like Rek'Sai to feel like she is allowed to do a 6-camp clear. And if you want to go for a 3-camp, go for it. If you want to level 3 gank, that's fine. But to let her be allowed to do a 6-camp clear and not feel like it's obviously griefing because it's too slow, I want to, kind of walk that back. And then the final change here is to Void Rush, where it's 50 flat damage getting added, which will make up for part of the bonus AD ratio nerf from the previous patch, as well as a 5% missing health increase. Now, it's actually worth noting that these base values are identical to Garen R. Of course, this is his physical damage, so it's worse than Garen R. But it's a bonus AD ratio to partially make up for it. But ultimately, like, hey, I am a big fan of ultimates being fairly reliable, that they are good without gold investment. And so you will often see me nerf the AD and AP ratios of ultimates, but I still want them to be powerful abilities. Right now, R is below, I think, the bar for a powerful ability. It is strictly worse Garen R. To be fair, this thing has a lot of reach. This thing, right, can go, I think it's 1,600 units. I think it's the max radius you can cast it. Additionally, it makes you untargetable, which makes it a really good in combat parry. It probably should not deal as much damage as Garen R, but right now the button is, to me, below the bar, to a lot of Rek'Sai players below the bar, and so damage going up. Some small total updates here as well. Let's talk about the math behind the Rek'Sai changes, though. Here is the champion damage for the E. It is buffed levels 3 through 12, so a solid portion of the early game, doing 15 to 5 whatever percent more damage. And then here is the rough expected. If you are damage capped, the damage your E is going to deal to a monster. You learn E at level 3 typically, and it's not a huge increase, but it's going to lightly increase your clear once you do your first quadrant. And if you go into do a level 4, 3 to 4 on your last 3 camps, you're going to get 8% more damage out of every E press. You're going to get an extra 13 damage every 10 seconds, which does something. It's some extra damage. It's going to take a second or so off your jungle clear. It's not a big deal, but it's going to do something. So next is a nerf to Senna. Senna right now is roughly a 50% win rate support, but around a 53% win rate primary bot laner. That is clearly too high. But 50% win rate at support is fine. That's a fairly balanced champion. The unfortunate thing is Senna is really, really close to being pro-jailed here. She is a absolute primary fixture in pro play right now. That's kind of unfortunate, so we'll have to probably do something to unwind that, either to Senna herself or systemically in some way. Some of this is hey, Frozen Heart's getting a little bit weaker, so that might help a little bit, and other things moving around, and if other sports are getting more powerful because Dreammaker's a bit nicer and whatnot, it might move the needle a little bit here, but regardless, I think something probably has to be changed if Senna is the default purchase here, the default play here. But ultimately, we're going after the gold scaling of Senna. Now, this matters for support Senna some, because you get plenty of souls with not all that much gold, but plenty of souls. If you're playing bot lane farm center, you're getting a lot of gold plus some souls every time you go for a trade. And so the thing about a bonus AD ratio is that essentially this is kind of like the spell has a total AD ratio, because instead of Senna gaining AD on level up, she's getting AD on souls plus normal gold scaling from normal sources, right? And so this ends up being a little bit more outsized than you might think in terms of actual impact. But we can talk about the numbers here. So here's a Rek'Sai R damage if someone's at half health. So a relatively squishy target at half HP, your damage is being increased by 25 to about 10%. You're getting a relatively tankier target with a lot more missing health. You're getting 20, a little bit more than this, right? Percentage wise, a little bit more, but again, a pretty solid increase to the R damage. Anyway, so here is a rough approximation of damage coming out of Senna Q. It's not huge, right? Don't get me wrong, but she's not outlandish again in support. It's specifically as a bot lane carry where she's really outperforming. This might mean that specifically bot lane, the average bot lane carry kind of sucks. I don't really believe that's true if you take an example of hey, what was Vayne's win rate in bot lane versus top lane before and after, right? With her systems not going under that much change, it was relatively similar, right? If you look at, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of things you can do to proxy for average champion power by taking champs who are played in multiple roles and seeing where they went. So this is how did mages do in bot lane in 14-1? Did they go up or down relative to marksman over there? How did mage supports do relative to tank supports? That can tell you about Zazak versus the other starting items. How, did a champion's jungle versus support skew go? That will tell you about, like if this champion's a gold scaler, how, things went in the various places, right? So a lot of things you can look at as proxies. Anyway, I'll also say that Senna is, of course, overperformant as a bot lane farmer in solo queue. She's overperformant specifically in pro play as a support, but she's, reasonably decent, like normal at support in solo queue. This is not a huge change, but it does have an impact, so it's a Senna nerf. So the second big kit update going on here is to Seraphine. This is meant to close the 6% win rate gap between Seraphine's support, which is where her primary audience is, and bot lane, where her secondary audience is. Only in high elo play, where players optimize for win rate, is Seraphine as popular in bot lane as she is in support. And the pick rate's been rising recently because people have realized that Seraphine is functionally an elo inflator champion player in the bot lane. There's actually a really easy report we have that is a champion's win rate and pick rate by role, by patch, as a very, very smooth line graph. From literally day one, Seraphine's primary play rate has literally always been support, and it's never been close. It's always been at least twice as many support players and mid laners on every single patch for the history of League of Legends. Also, at some points in time, Seraphine was a 58% win rate bot laner. Before she was discovered, and she was a 51% or whatever win rate mid laner with a very large support player base. At various points in time, she was 57 or 58% win rate in bot lane. She has been a turbo overpowered but unnoticed bot laner for the vast majority of her life. I'm not even sure there's been a single patch where Seraphine's been below 51 in bot lane for her entire life. This champ has always been a massive elo inflator in bot lane, basically forever. And to be fair, I think Seraphine is probably balanced at 51 and change when she's played as an AP carry, because she's often used to fix an all AD team comp or to fix actually having some engage in the team overall. But as Seraphine's pick rate has increased, thus, she's not getting used as a comp fixer, less and less frequently, her win rate has maintained at around 53.5% in bot lane. So she's not just a comp fixer, she's also just overpowered. And yet, despite massive, massive, massive power disparities, she is still incredibly more popular for most League of Legends players as a support. This has always been true for Seraphine. Her best role has literally never been support. It has always been her most popular role. We should support Seraphine's support for her primary audience and actually allow her to be appropriately powerful in that role. If you think otherwise, I vehemently think you are wrong. Okay, so there are a lot of tactics here meant to, number one, primarily directionally fix bot lane versus support role skew. I think ultimately Seraphine bot lane will always, always, always be more powerful than Seraphine mid. Her kit scales off being near a teammate. That will always be a bot lane skewed aspect. Even all of the old versions of Seraphine where she had level scaling on the W and all that stuff, she was still winning more games in bot lane than mid. There has never been a single version of Seraphine that won more games in mid lane than in bot lane. No matter what we have done anytime ever, she has always been a stronger bot laner. At the very least, now players have identified that she is very, very good in bot lane. And honestly, the fact that there is some viable mages, support-ish, quasi-support mage champions in bot lane is good for the role having some a larger audience of players who might want to play this role now, in terms of having some variance in terms of the types of champions played there, because we basically only have subtypes of marksmen down there. Like, these are positive things for League of Legends in the game. I am very happy if Seraphine remains a fixture of bottom lane, as long as she's not an overpowered fixture of bottom lane. And support players are very clearly happy to play Seraphine, so let's give them a champion that is not griefing their team to play her. So again, the primary thing is fixing the massive disparity between the role power. The second thing is saying that while we acknowledge, there's basically sub-goals, which is let's make the builds for these two distinct roles make sense. For Seraphine support, there is a, I think, very logical suggestion for any skill order on the champion. QE, EQ, WQ, QW, EW, and WE all have logical reasons to make sense as the skill order that you would go for on this champion. You can play her as a mage, you can play her as a full support that's utility focused with WE, right? You can play the current version, which is Q and W because those are the best skills. All these make logical sense. But my understanding of the primary bot lane APC Seraphine player is they want to be primarily a mage. They want to max Q and E. And they want to build mostly full ability power while doing so. And so on the one hand, it's like, let's flatten out the rank ups for the average support player who is going to buy a Moonstone a lot of the time, who's going to buy a Sapphire Flow a lot of the time, who's going to do these kinds of situations. And let's try to like roughly flatten out so that all these builds can make sense and situationally give you room for optimization and be, oh, this is a game for WE Seraphine. Cool, I'm playing one of like 6 different versions of the champion because every skill order can be good. Cool, there's a lot of mastery up there for being really good at Seraphine and picking the right version of Seraphine. It's like you got the skin picker in champ select, but then you do it in the game as well. It's like there's some like real value there, right? On the other hand, I think the primary audience for APC Seraphine is to be an AP carry, to max Q and E, which means the incentives have to be there to make maxing E good. Because right now, maxing E is literally always a trap. No matter what where you're playing, E is garbage and W is incredibly good. If you're a support, you should max W first. If you're an APC, you have to max W second, even if you don't want to. So W is too good to max, and E is not good enough to max. So that is an immediate pressure there as well, is bring those things closer together, but then also give room for her to not have to max Q at support. If she doesn't want to, she likely will. That's fine if the primary Seraphine support audience is to play, like Karma or Lux as a mostly mage. That's fine, but to give the opportunity, right? Okay. So let's go down to it, and then again, reinforce that the AP carry build wants to be high AP, wants to build a death cap, wants to, press Q, press E, do a lot of damage. Okay, so number one, a bit of power that we think is support skewed. Bot laners sit in lane, taking up farm for a lot longer. Supports roam much more often. They go ward, they go to roam between their lanes, they go to join their team fights. APCs often get sit in a lane and farm. So plus move speed, a little bit nudged towards support. Mana regen gets shifted from mana growth to mana regen growth. Instead of 25 mana growth, you're getting 0.55 mana regen growth. This is relatively power neutral at basically at normal items at 3 minutes of regen, which is a pretty reasonable timer to be out on the map with mana spent. But if you have a support item, this skews up with mana regen. So, you have your Solstice Slay or Zazex or whatever, like that's going to give you mana regen, which is going to skew towards that item. It also does skew up the, Staff of Flowing Water and Moonstone a little bit, but okay, she's getting nudged in some cases towards support items. Understandable, that is happening. Base AD down by 5 is obviously a lot. If you are a conventional marksman, it is less of a big deal if you are a support. It is less of a big deal if you're an AP carry, but yes, she's going to have among the lowest base AD in the game. To be fair though, after every spell she gets notes, which will functionally increase her AD immediately, as well as the fact that she has really, really good AoE spells, which makes last hitting pretty easy anyway. So in most cases, you're still going to have enough AD with the Doran's Ring, giving you, 4 or 5 free on hit damage as well, that it's not going to be that bad, and you're going to have, a reasonable time last hitting minions, but yes, this will be a bot lane skewed nerf that will have less of an impact towards support. The passive is being skewed basically toward the early game and a little bit away from AP. The passive being stronger, I think, is support skewed because the support doesn't have to right-click minions. So if you're the typical bot lane APC and you press 3 spells and then you're not in auto attack range or a minion gets low, it's like, well, I could auto you for 50 damage and 6 notes or whatever, or I can auto this minion and get 21 gold. And oftentimes you'll just pick 21 gold and you'll waste your notes. You just like last hit the minion, whatever. On the other side, the support doesn't really have to make that choice and can just right-click the Nami or whatever, or the Lucian, and get some note damage. And so shifting note damage toward early game, toward the first 10 levels, will be a bigger buff for support than it will be for bot lane, where it's not really going to matter. And then even though this mod is getting lowered and the base AD is getting lower, the fact that notes are better, levels 2 through 10 functionally, I mean, this does very lightly walk back some of the last hitting nerfs, but I'm not going to make any claims that last hitting got easier, because it didn't. And then late game, it kind of falls off, but neither of these roles, really bot lane or support, are going to get that many levels. So it's a nerf 16 plus if the game goes really, really late, but it doesn't really matter. I just want to give this thing linear scaling because this was just really, really weird breakpointing. And if we want to raise the scaling of note sum and make this 4 to 30 or 5 to 35 or something, we could do that at some point, right? As just an easy tweak, but I was just a fan of making this scale much more cleanly because it's much easier to control when that happens. So here are the beginning of the PvP damage increases. Missile speed increased by 100 here on High Note. The missile speed of High Note is actually the same as Lucid Singularity, which is Lux E, but because the spell blooms, it actually takes longer than Lux E to deal damage, and so an increase in missile speed says, okay, it is still somewhat dodgeable, in the way that Lux E is kind of dodgeable, but it's going to feel a lot better. You're going to get much more reliable poke, and so if you are playing Seraphine for the PvP aspect, it's going to be better. If you're playing Seraphine just as a raw support, where you're just going to try to poke people, it's better. If you're using it to attack minions, they're not dodging it anyway, so whatever. A very light skew here on High Note toward better cooldown early game, a little bit worse cooldown late game. A lot of this is actually buying power budget for increasing the rank 5 Q value, because we're increasing the base damage of the spell and the execute damage of the spell. And so in order to buy that power budget, because the spell is going to deal more damage in basically every PvP case, it's going to hit more often, it's going to hit harder, and it's going to hit harder in a multiplicative manner, you aren't allowed to cast it quite as often. And that is a make good, because right now the best way to play Seraphine is to always double cast your W, because the W is so much more reliable and so much more powerful that basically we're trying to siphon power off of maxing W and double casting W and put the power onto double casting Q. And so the more power in an individual Q cast, the better a double casted Q is, right? And so we're trying to push that, but I think there is a ceiling on how high this quota is allowed to be. I think that is actually around 6 seconds. At the highest is 7. I think that would be really, really pushing it, and probably not okay. But 6 to me was the level to where I thought this was actually a passable number and how much damage we could give the ability overall. But this, along with the mana cost change, says, hey, you really, really don't have to max Q if you're playing support Seraphine. You are okay 1 point wording W, because you're still getting 8 of the 6 seconds of the cooldown. You're not getting the big mana cost decrease, and you're still getting 60 of the 160 base damage. If you want to skip a maxing Q, you are allowed to as support Seraphine. Now, many of them still will. That is fine. But it's allowing the space for E or EW max or whatever for support Seraphine. Damage is up by a flat 5. Execute damage is up by 10%. Missile speed is up by about 8%. This all combines for Q being a better skill that is a bit costlier and is not up quite as often, but is more worth double casting. I think are all directionally good for the champion. Good for the champion overall. Now, the damage amp no longer affects non-champions, so minions and monsters. You are not going to be as fast helping your team kill dragon. You're not going to be quite as fast at clearing waves. And one thing I want to point out, though, is keep in mind that if you're ever like double casting Q on a wave, your first Q never had the amp anyway, and your second Q would have a partial amp. But the thing is, if your first Q brought the minions to half health anyway, the second amp didn't do anything. So you actually never got full amp on minions, because if you did, the double cast was killing it no matter what. And if you were killing minions with the amp on the Q, they were already low enough to die to the Q itself regardless. And so there's a lot of cases where this amp not affecting minions basically never actually mattered, because you overkilled them regardless. This will still matter. Like, the amount of minions that Seraphine kills per game will go down this patch. There is no way around this. This is clearly going to be a nerf to wave clear. There were cases where you would single cast Q after a double E or something, and you might not hit the breakpoint anymore. That will happen. That will be true. That will be a real thing that'll happen here. Or, you know, it gets worn down by some else thing going on, or you're doing a single Q into a single Q, and it's only rank 2, so you're not, you know, getting all that much damage, and you're, you know, fighting the melee minions for the, like, yes, Seraphine will kill fewer minions next patch. The nice thing is, though, as a support buff, she's going to kill far fewer of her AD carries minions as well, because she won't steal that farm away. She won't as mistakenly jack the double cast minions from a double cast Q or whatever. Also, removing the cheating rule where the Q would prevent minions from dying to minion damage while the Q was in flight and nearby. So this is, of course, a nerf. This says, hey, Seraphine, you have a very, very large AoE, solid base damage, solid AP ratio, low cooldown spell that hits the entire wave every single time. You've got an E that does the same thing. You got to be a little bit more graceful. You've got to try a little bit harder to get your last hits. That is what's going to be required of you. More of your power in lane is around offensive interactions with enemy champions. Less of your power in lane is in being able to easily clear the wave from far away. You'll run out of mana if you're pressing Q on cooldown. You've got to fight for it a little bit more. All that kind of stuff. Moving in that direction. Okay? Okay. Next is a nerf to maxing W, because maxing W was always correct and there was no room for maxing E instead. So rank 1 W is getting much better with a 6-second cooldown buff, a 10 mana cost buff, and a 10 flat shield buff. So anywhere where you were playing QE Seraphine, it was always incorrect, but congratulations, W is just a better ability than before. And you can now play QE Seraphine with a better PvP Q, a worse PvE Q. We'll get to the E changes later. But hey, if you're playing QE Seraphine, congratulations. you now have the room to play QE Seraphine. If you want to play WMAX Seraphine, which is generally speaking correct, the incentive is not quite there. Now, if you are finishing WMAX, your cooldown is 2 seconds longer, but your shield is 10 points bigger, and the mana cost is 10 points lower. So WMAX Seraphine is still decent. It's getting nerfed by, 2 seconds in the top end here, and, hey, your rank 1 Q is still a bit nicer, but, if you're playing WQ Seraphine, it's not that far off, but you're hitting a power drop after like level, 8 or 7 or something, right? But it was already, a pretty good build, so not that far off, not that big of a deal. Now that said, trying to buy power budget for the AP ratios on Seraphine to be about her damage, so that if Seraphine is there to be a support and she's there to give her team a lot of bonus move speed and a lot of shielding and whatnot, she can do that by getting heal and shield power. And so you can do that through getting ability haste and lowering this cooldown from 18 seconds to 10 seconds or lower, right? But if you're playing Seraphine to play high AP Seraphine and your power budget is in Q, your power budget is in E, you are not giving your team much more move speed, right? You're buying high AP, you're buying death cap, you're not getting haste, you're not getting a bunch of move speed, you're not getting a bunch of extra shielding, you're not getting the extra healing as well. If you're playing AP Seraphine, you're playing AP Seraphine to play Q, to play E. If you're playing haste Seraphine, you're playing enchanter item Seraphine, you're playing Seraphine to, amp your W pretty heavily. That to me makes sense in terms of saying, okay, what are you getting out of the build? Well, heal and shield power is going to be better than AP at making W better. It's going to be better than AP at making the W healing better. Ability haste is going to be far better than ability power at making the move speed better. That's the goal. That's what's going on here. W, again, strictly buffed as a 1-point wonder unless you have lots of ability power, but even then, even though the move speed is going to be lower at high AP, the cooldown is so much lower that it's probably going to still be better. And because you are likely to 1-point wonder the W, you might not want to waste your double cast on 60 flat shield. 60 shield with an AP ratio, sure, but like even at 300 AP, this is still only plus 60, right? I can double cast W on 3% missing health per champion and 120 shield, or I can put the W cast on 320 plus 60% AP ratio times 1.6. And so, moving these things together to say QE Seraphine, you don't have to double W, here you go, right? Beat drop. So beat drop is now made to have a real cooldown incentive. This is primarily there to say, hey, AP Seraphine, there is a real reason to max this, but also support Seraphine, there's a real reason to max this over your Q or your W as well. So every single one of these lines says, go ahead and max this ability now. So E now has a 2-second cooldown incentive between rank 1 and rank 5. E now has a 0.4 second CC duration incentive between rank 1 and rank 5. E no longer has a 20 mana cost disincentive between rank 1 and rank 5. That said, there is a damage rank up nerf. This is actually meant, this is here because of double cast parity. So because Q has a 160 base damage, old E had 200 base damage, you could get in states where E was a better damage tool than Q, especially if you're playing E max Seraphine. And I want to try to make sure that Q max Seraphine would still make sense. And so I brought up rank 1 because I think it was fine. This thing never had a damage amp on it, so you were going to be kind of always okay here. But putting the max down to 190 makes it not so much higher than Q that it's okay. At most levels of missing health, this is going to be higher damage on Q than damage on E. There's going to be some cases where E is going to be still higher damage. Okay, fine. But in many cases, like Q is always going to be a higher damage finisher, and then Q, then E will always be, of course, better for crowd control. And you can choose between the two which one you want to do. This might also be retuned a little bit. Like maybe at some point we take another, 10 to like 5 to 25 damage off of E or something, and we buy room elsewhere on like an AP ratio or something, right? Like I'm fine doing that, right? And make sure that the incentives are in the right place. But for now, I really want to make sure that like it read as though maxing E could be reasonable, and it's still having a solid 120 damage on rank up, as well as 2 seconds and 0.4 seconds, and the only one without a mana cost incentive, to me was enough to try to make that happen. And then continue the trends of Seraphine is just too good as sort of AFK and lane wave clear bot, took the mini damage down on E here. So ultimately, if you are playing QW Seraphine, for the most of the game, your W is a lower cooldown with more shielding, with better mana cost, but your E is going to have a longer cooldown. To be fair, a little bit more damage since you have a lot of AP, but also less CC profile and worse wave clear. So QW Seraphine gets weaker, right? QW Seraphine, loses some W power, loses some wave clear power, and loses some E power straight up. Then R is a very light touch. This is just me, again, deciding that, hey, I want AP ratios, if there's room for them, to be on the E, to be on the Q. These are where I want the AP ratio to actually live. The damage amp has function AP ratio increase here. The AP ratio are meant to live on Q and E. Those are your tools. I want R to be roughly equally good no matter how good your build is going. Seraphine's late game is already, like, honestly kind of absurd. This is one of the best ults in the game. By the way, Encore's CC duration scales with rank. It goes from 1.25 to 1.75. So rank 3 ult is 100 second cooldown, 1.75 hard CC. This is better than Mumu Ultimate. Like, and you don't have to be in danger to do it. You just get it every time. I think the skill is way, way too good at rank 3, and so bringing it down. We can do it again. Look at this sort of through the lens of math. So here is, if you're playing basically core AP Seraphine, and this is about how much mana you have before and after, over the course of 3 minutes regenning, it is about 3% less mana in the mid game. Not a big deal, but it does have an impact. If you're playing with a support item, this is tier 1 support item, this is tier 2 support item, this is tier 3 support item. If you never go Staff of Flowing Water, if you never go, any of these other items like Mishrelia's or whatnot, then this is still your mana table as a support versus your mana table as a bot laner. Here's the passive damage, right? If you're playing high AP Seraphine, yeah, again, for most of your early game, it is better. There's a couple levels here, like, yeah, do you really care about level 1 notes? Not really. At level 2 notes, it's basically the same number, right? This is 6.8 or 6.7. Like, is it a nerf? Not really. But then, yeah, you get very meaningful, meaty increases between level 3 and 10. And then, yeah, 11 onwards, you're sort of later into the game. The sort of team fight stage, yeah, your autos, you're still the bonus range is still going to be pretty decent damage per note. Like, this is still very valuable. It's going to natively scale off the fact that you've got teammates around. You're getting a bunch of extra damage. Your notes, you get like roughly double value. You have 4 people around you versus just yourself. Plus the range is linearly better, so you get 5 times as much range per cast. Yeah, big deal here. Again, early game buff, make her much stronger. Going for trades. If you're playing, a lower AP build, a more supportive Seraphine build, you get different breakpoints here. Where like the level 14 breakpoint, your AP doesn't overtake. Your breakpoint at level 15 is much nicer as well. Though again, level 15 pretty fake for an enchanter, for an actual support. But regardless, right? This is a solid amount of green extra, and yeah, kind of meant to be the goal here. That notes are better for support than they are for bot lane. Though still actually better for bot lane, right? Like this is a laning phase buff to bot lane Seraphine in the fact that she will want to queue and auto and scrap with you, and for most points in time it's going better than before. So if you want to play a bit more offensive and kill people in lane as Seraphine, not just sit in lane and farm, you are literally better at it for your laning phase up until about one item. And then for support Seraphine, again, this already thing that you can do. Q cooldown, literally just stronger, levels 1 through 6. Keep in mind, base damage on Q is better, cooldown on Q is better, levels 1 and 2 mana cost is equal or better, missile speed is better, execute damage on champions is better. Like, Seraphine's ability to trade with you in lane is just getting stronger, right? Again, here's the cheaper mana cost, here's the lower cooldown. For a large portion of the early laning phase, up until about 10 minutes, Q is in all cases, basically a better trading tool, better at fighting off enemy champions and battling back for lane control. Meaningful cooldown buff, meaningful, mana cost buff, meaningful damage buff. So here is the minimum damage. I'm hitting someone at max HP. This is, of course, how much damage you are dealing to a full health minion as an example here. This is a high AP build in both sides of the data table. So, your level 9 damage is up by 5. I mean, every damage is up by 5, of course, right? This is not going to be any different. But hey, what is your damage to a max health minion, to a max health champion? It's up by 5. Of course, this is now your new number compared to this against a low health minion, or compared to this against a low health minion. But low health minions would always be killed. But hey, if you're using this to actually finish off a champion, your Thresh or Blitzcrank or Leona or whatever found and engage, or you've been trading really well via your passive, via your Q poke being reliable, and now they're getting lower on health. Well, your Q as a damage skill is a solid, 10% stronger or so in the early game. Falls off a little bit as time goes on with AP ratio. If we have the room for power budget, like if AP Seraphine is weak next patch, we can buff AP ratio on Q and like really make this thing hit hard. That's totally fine. But, I basically estimated where power budget would be and the power levels would be, and this is where we are right now. But, happy to buff AP ratios where needed if she needs the power, right? That's not hard to do. But, meaningful PvP damage increase to your primary damage tool. This is, a nice meaty 570 for a spell with a 6-second cooldown. You can double cast. That's a lot, right? This is, 4-item Seraphine on, like, her normal, like, high AP builds, like Seraph Riley's stuff. A double cast Q is, potentially almost 1,200 damage. That's before Gathering Storm, right? And other ways that add a little bit of ability power here and there. So, like, yeah, that's quite a lot of available damage here, right? Like, a double cast Q can be, 1,000 damage realistically against, a moderately injured target. So, there's some real power here, right? This is on a more Enchanter low AP build. The numbers are, percentage-wise a little bit nicer. Again, flat 5, percentage increase. In terms of, total max damage, yeah, it is lower, right? If you're playing Enchanter Seraphine, you're more likely to, want to double cast your W or your E than your Q because your Q is just not carrying as much damage, of course. But that's expected if you're not playing high AP Seraphine, that you're not going to be double casting Q very often. Very understandable there. But regardless, percentage damage-wise, yeah, solid increase. So look at W cooldown. If you're maxing it second, it is a buff for the first 11 levels of the game. So if you are playing QW Seraphine, your Q is strictly better, basically levels 1 through, I guess, 8 until the cooldown gets worse. But even then, the base damage is higher at, all points of time. But up until level 11, you have a just strictly stronger W via the cooldown, via the shielding, via the, for the most part, move speed. But, like, yeah, the skill is stronger for a lot longer. There is a very, very big early game buff to Seraphine. All of this was, it felt like, using W as a damage block in lane was kind of a trap. It was very expensive. The amount of shielding was very, very low. And the cooldown was so long that you couldn't really play the other side of it. And so this says, no, actually, as Seraphine, you're allowed to use Q for offense and W for defense. Let's make sure that, pressing rank 1 W is not a trap. But yeah, if you max W first, by level 13, you've got a longer cooldown. Congratulations. This, can matter. So, hey, W max Seraphine is going to be a little bit worse here. If you're maxing at third, it's just a buff for, basically all points in time. Level 17 is kind of fake on a bot lane or a support. So, third max, W Seraphine is just strictly better. Again, right now, W max has to be max first or second. So moving it toward third is directionally correct. We might have overshot a little bit. We'll see. Of course, if you're maxing E second, which is probably going to be happening now, here is the cooldown difference. This is the one thing that is actually a nerf. Your Q is better, your W is better, but your E is worse until level 10. And then you get the same cooldown, and then, hey, as you get later into the game, you have more E cast, you have more crowd control, and ultimately more damage. The CC duration, the break even is also around this level 10 here. So 1 through 9, E is a weaker skill. 10 plus E is a better skill in terms of cooldown and or CC profile. In terms of the actual damage of the skill, because the AP ratio increase, even though rank 5 has a base damage decrease, E is always doing more damage, worth noting, right? The cooldown is 10% longer, but the damage is 20% higher. So in terms of DPS of E, E is always, always, always higher. And then you get to, hey, your cooldown is 10% lower and then it's 10% higher. E is always a bigger damage tool, right? So if you're playing second max E Seraphine, it is always, always, always dealing more damage in all points in time as a function of DPS. Your Q is essentially always dealing more damage as a function of DPS at all points in time. And if you're playing QE Seraphine, W is just always a shorter cooldown. Congratulations. The one thing you are losing is the CC profile of E. That matters. Again, you're losing wave clear, you're losing E as wave clear. Those all matter. If you're playing an Enchanter Seraphine build on the E, the AP ratio means less. You can see instead of getting 21, you're getting 19. Instead of getting 17, you're getting 12. Instead of getting 109, you're getting 103. But even for an Enchanter focused Seraphine build, she's getting a little bit more per cast of E. So yeah, pretty big changes here. This is again pretty much a strict buff to QE Seraphine. Obviously, again, R has some strict power negatives here. The passive as a minion killer, the Q as a minion killer, the base AD here, like those are all strict nerfs, right? Those are like the only strict nerfs to the champion, and the rest is basically power positive in ways that I'm pretty sure Seraphine players will appreciate. If you want to play pure mage APC, or you want to play Enchanter with any kind of build, or support with any kind of build you want, I think all these can move directionally in the right way. And I don't mind fiddling a little bit. If APC Seraphine is too weak, AP ratio on Q, AP ratio on E, AP ratio on passive, no big deal. If Enchanter Seraphine or Support Seraphine, has no W rank up incentive and W max actually really sucks, we can move W to 2 seconds per rank up and make it closer to the E rank up. If, the numbers can be moved around, but it's like, can we get this champion to a level of normalcy where she's not a nearly must nerf for bot lane and a nearly must buff for support? Now that we're closer together, we can tweak further as needed if it's needed, but the hope is that she's about 51% win rate in low elo as both a bot lane APC and a support. And that is where we think this is targeted. We think she's going to be a low elo skewed support. That is fine. But that's the hope that we're getting here. Let's see if that happens. We move on to a very simple buff to Sivir. This gives Sivir the highest base armor of any conventional bot laner, conventional bot lane marksman in the game. To be fair, I think there's a difference between someone like Sivir and, let's say, Draven, Lucian, Kalista, where they are aggressive, they are offensive skewed, they're trying to kill you, but you should be able to fight them back when they screw up. Sivir is not a kill you kind of laner, and she can't play safe either. She has 5 out attack range, and her Q is expensive enough that she can't just press Q to farm. And so Sivir being baseline very tanky actually fits the sort of shape of the champion in that she just has to take damage to play her landing phase out. It's not glamorous, but I do think of bot laners who are meant to be the highest level 1 tankiness, Sivir is probably number 1. And then you might consider champs like Nidalee, but she has an active dodge and whatnot, and so it gets a little bit different, right? But I could be convinced that Nidalee should be above Sivir here. Regardless, the tools are a bit different. We then move on to a small update to Smolder. So I want to give some context around these changes. This is driven by the champion designer wanting to clean up anything that he feels is still sort of left over on the kit that now that this champ has been live for a while and players have been able to experiment with builds, identifying, okay, what are the things that are maybe out of place or that we can still push and be on fantasy? And so my view of it being in part of these conversations is around build freedom / build optimization and around playing up champion fantasy. So we'll just go line by line for each one. So Super Scorcher Breath, instead of getting 6.25% max health, the second you get 225, it is going to be a very large AD ratio plus AP ratio plus dragon stack ratio that at some point does less, at some point does more. And what this basically says is that AD is probably your best build, and if you start to build tank, you're going to feel it in your passive stacking. It also says that further stacking is going to be good for you. Looking at Smolder's power curve, his win rate by game time, and comparing it to other champions like Kayle or Aurelion Sol, he is nowhere close to Aurelion Sol late game. So this is from memory because I looked it up I think 2 days ago. Smolder's win rate in games over 30 minutes long on 14.4 is like 52%. Aurelion Sol's win rate in games that are over 30 minutes long is like 58%. It's like super not close. Now, it might be that the fact that this is it's an Elder Dragon burn and the execute where the sound effect plays out, people might totally feel the late game of Smolder more than they feel the late game of Aurelion Sol. But Smolder's not even the best scaling marksman in current League of Legends, let alone remotely close to the other Dragon scaler. So there is a lot of room this can go before this ends up actually being true. And I want to point out that like this does literally nothing up until 19 to 28 minutes when you get your evolve on. There were some LCS games over the weekend where we were seeing like 26, 28 minute evolves. I played a game with Whippo in solo queue a week ago and he got it at like 19. So, you know, if you're playing the chaos of solo queue with an actual LCS pro, again, you can get it pretty early, but that's still, you know, on a relatively high side. But like, regardless, like this is not going to affect his pre-20 minute win rate basically at all. And in fact, the 20 minute, you know, switch, it's actually going to be weaker there as well. Let's talk about the math here. So here is the burn damage. This is 225 stacks up into some astronomical 480 stacks. And this is if you're building a literally full tank. You're building Iceborne Gauntlet and a Jack Show. I don't know why you're building this, but like you're literally not building any AD at all, runes, anything. It's just the base value, and it's never close. So this is what you're, theoretically getting got by not building AD, is you actually just don't deal any damage if you don't do this. This is intentional. We will never, ever, I think, support tank Smolder. That is unacceptable. The other side, we know that 225 stacks, if you're doing it pretty quickly, is going to happen at around 2 items. This is Udoran's Ring, Stat Shards, Essence Reaver, Spear of Shojin. And at 225 stacks, 2 items, it's about 4.4%. So the burn is cut by about a third. Now you still have the execute. You still have all the other damage on the spell, the damage per hit, everything else is all still there, the ulti damage, the auto attack damage, all that stuff is there. But just the burn itself is weaker the instant you transform. And it's going to take, and what I basically did is I said, okay, the road from 225 to 480 stacks is the road from 2 items to 5 items. And this is adding Bloodthirster, adding Rapid Fire Cannon, and adding, I think it's Guardian Angel is the most common 5th item here. And so it's adding a lot more bonus AD and a lot more stacks. You know, if we interpolate this all sort of quasi-linearly, full item 480 stack Smolder is 10% max HP. That's not astronomical. That's obviously quite good, right? But like a 10% max health burn over 3 seconds when I'm a 5-item marksman, is that really the primary damage at that point? And the answer is probably no. So I want to be clear here. The goal with these total hinges of Smolder are win rate negative. Smolder is currently, I believe, overpowered. If we take around 1% win rate off of Smolder, that is good. I think that is roughly what we want to do right now, is take about 1% win rate off this champion. And we have a lot of room to play up the fantasy of this champion, which is to be a stacker and to scale into the end game. And we have a lot of room to do so, and so we are. We go on to the next change. This is, by the way, pretty much a strict buff. This is Flap, Flap, Flap is being moved from crit-based to simply Dragon Stack-based. Now, the damage on Flap, Flap, Flap is based on, I believe, both bonus AD and stacks itself. So stacks multiplicably self-scale this spell. Again, the math here is quite win rate positive. It is a very meaningful amount of increased power here. Well, I should say it is a meaningful amount of increased power. But sorry, I need 1 second. And then I will keep going here. But ultimately, this is one place that we are acknowledging that we are putting power into this champion. And that is intentional because right now E is being primarily used as only an escape. Obviously, there are sometimes places where you want to use it aggressively, but by and large, we want to play up E as part of the offensive combat pattern, and so we are giving more power to E's offense. So let's talk about the math here on how this goes. So if our stacks are 25 to 450, and we expect you to go and like you don't really have to care about the left side column here, but essentially this is going for his basically normal build of going from 0 bonus crit to 80% bonus crit. Like his normal full build is, I believe, 80% bonus crit with just Shojin. I mean, it could be Shojin and Gia, but let's assume you like even sell boots, right? And you have 80% crit on your full build. You can go from 5 shots to 9 shots based on how much crit chance you have. If you somehow go to the astronomical 4 to 50 crit chance or 4 to 50 stacks, which is again not really realistic, but at 225 stacks, is about. If we see 225 stacks is 3 items, which is, crit item 1, crit item 2, right? Here's as Reaver, here's BT or RFC, and 225 stacks is, 20 minutes in the game. This is probably a little bit aggressive item-wise, but it's like, oh, you would have 9 shots by that point in time. So, if we're optimistically expecting our items to come in at, this pacing, we just get more shots, right? So, I mean, basically, like, kind of no matter how you slice it, you are just getting more damage out of your E to the tune of, I mean, honestly, like, once you're in a mid game, like 20 to 50% more shots. Now, this is unrealistic, but 20 to 40% more shots is not outlandish here. So E as an offensive tool into the mid game, much more powerful. Again, power positive here, right? So then there are some tweaks to the R. So this is simultaneously 2 things. So it is one. Once again, reinforcing playing the build. So you notice that there is now an AD ratio on the heal here. But the second thing is trying to play up the specific elements of R to make R sharper, make you care more about the self-heal. So that means you have to make sure that you are staying inside the zone when R is cast. Also playing up the amount that the sweet spot matters, so that the edge case shots are getting worse to the tune of 25 to 75 damage. And the sweet spot zones are getting better to the tune of getting multiplied, but also the functional bonus AD ratio goes up in the sweet spot. Saying that no, the accuracy on R is going to matter more, and being able to grab the selfie is going to matter more, and all that while putting more emphasis in the relative value of the bonus AD ratio in both cases to play up that AD Smolder is the primary build of this champion. Yes, there is an AP ratio here that's been added. Okay, congratulations, but in pretty much every other case, the AD ratio is being incentivized and promoted as a larger portion of the power budget to basically the call here is AP as the alt build makes sense in the way that AP Misfortune occasionally exists, where it's like, oh, here's a team comp where I'm not allowed to auto attack, so I'm going to go for Liandry's and just use E-Poke and R as my damage tools because there's no point in building AD anyway. And a similar case here for Smolder, where it's like, oh wow, they're all gigantic health stackers and my team is all AD and I've already locked in Smolder. Okay, it's the 1 in 15 games where AP Smolder is correct here. I'm going to go for Shojin, Liandry's, and Riftmaker, and the AP ratios are there to allow the alt build. The alt build is not the dominant build. I think this is relatively accurate here. I think it's reasonably close at these tunings. Anyway, we can talk about the math on the R itself. So here was the healing difference before and after. Again, this is using a default AD build. The healing matters more. Again, it's power positive. Here is the non-sweet spot R damage is down by about 10%. Here's a sweet spot R damage. It's up by about 5%. So you can tell me which one you think is more likely to happen in terms of champion combat. Are you more likely to hit non-sweet spots or sweet spots on champions? And by what degree? Because this is nerfed more than it's buffed. So the R damage is probably a little bit power down. The R healing is clearly power up. The E shots is clearly power up, and the the Q power curve is neutral to maybe power down. I think on whole, these are probably nerfs to Smolder to a small degree. Not huge, right? These are all, taps. All the other parts of his damage haven't really moved here. The execute hasn't moved, the base damage on Q hasn't moved, the gold scaling overalls hasn't moved, but a little bit of power down to a champion and trying to play up the fantasy of him being a scaling pick. So now we go on to Twisted Fate. So ultimately, I want to be clear that we missed on our not so much intended magnitude, but our goals with Twisted Fate in the previous patch. Our process failed to grab Twisted Fate as an important nerf in 14.4. And so very, very late, like literally 2 hours before we cut the patch and said, okay, we've stopped development on 14.4, we decided, wait, you know what? We should nerf TF. And with so little time to do research, develop the changes, QA the changes, I did the changes because I was in and ready to make the call and said, okay, let's just take 1% win rate off because I looked at the data and it looked like both APTF and ADTF as a mid laner gained out 1% win rate. And of course, bot lane TF and top lane TF didn't exist before, so getting a win rate delta on those was fraudulent and not really possible. And also at that time, he was only around 51% win rate from what we saw. on, you know, the first few days, because keep in mind, right, this is, you know, barely 1 week into the patch, so players hadn't really identified optimal builds yet either. And so what we were seeing is like, okay, yeah, he's a little bit overpowered in all these roles. We'll take 1% off everywhere. And so we went to go take 1% off AP, which we did. We got that pretty much on magnitude. And we tried to take about 1% off of ADTF, but the thing that we kind of overlooked was that even though that change would have been 1% win rate off for a conventional marksman, so much of TF's power is in just being able to stun you that generic damage nerfs wouldn't be as important as it would for someone like Jinx or Aphelios or Xayah, even who, you know, these champs have some crowd control, but it's not like a core factor. And so TF cared less about a generic damage nerf than a replacement marksman would. And then as time went on, players learned to optimize their builds. They learned that Energize was the correct build. Like Shiv was not the most common first item on this champion the first few days of the patch, at least from my recollection anyway. And so as builds optimized, people got better and better and better at ADTF, and then became apparent that, oh, ADTF is extremely overpowered. Now what's funny is he still has a lower win rate than Taric, but that doesn't mean he's not overpowered. That just means that Observed's win rate does not tell the full story. Twisted Fate is overpowered. Twisted Fate should not be crowding out either top laners or bot laners, nor crowding out the dominant build for him in mid lane. TF being viable is totally fine, right? This is not taking TF out to the shed and shooting him in the back of the head. This is TF should not be an overpowered top laner or an overpowered bot laner. Let's go see what 50% or 49.5% winner Twisted Fate looks like. Does he have a player base? Does he have a ban rate? Does he have a play rate? Does he, you know, is he acceptable as a balanced, not overpowered champion? One thing I've seen a lot of players do in discourse around the game is talk in really, really big extremes around like, oh, guess the ADTF experiment failed. It's like, well, no, ADTF was overpowered. This is what we expect to be balanced ADTF. This is now the real ADTF experience. And yeah, he was buffed when we added this change in 14.2 because there wasn't enough data to know actually how strong ADTF was. Because we also really, really didn't know that it was going to go all energized. We could assume that crit was going to be more likely since Rageblade lost the crit conversion passive. You had to build crit items in a lot of cases here on this champion to just like get functional items. We know he wants RFC. We knew he's going to have some crit in his default appetite, right? But like the actual power of Shiv's Stormrazor, it's a lot harder to guess when literally no one builds it, and then you have to put in a bunch of changes. You're like, how good is this? We don't know. There was enough data to look at like Rageblade style builds and be like, well, if he's going Rageblade with Zen Bork, that's not that much bonus AD, and so I mean, we can give him some ratios, but you know, and like for Rageblade Bork builds, I think is where it's actually pretty reasonable is the thing. But it's the energized builds, which you know we didn't have data on, and yeah, we ended up overshooting on a build that we couldn't get a winner estimation on, and he was overtuned. And then we, you know, to be fair, it was our bad for not catching him as an appropriate nerf back in 0.4. That's our bad, to be clear. But anyway, to come in and say, okay, let's put ADTF as a balanced champion and see where it goes from there. And so the attack speed on E is going down 0 to 10%. The bonus AD ratio on E is going down from 75 to 20% bonus AD, specifically targeting the high AD energized builds. This will relatively touch less the high AS on hit builds, but will more aggressively hit the Shiv Stormrazor stuff where the bonus attack speed from items is generally quite low. Boost of Swiftness, for example, being a very common item on him, especially in top lane, because all you need to do is space people because you have more than enough attack speed from other sources in your kit. Why bother going for the rest of the gold scaling? Alrighty, so let's talk about the changes, what they mean. So ADTF attacks per second using his normal core energized build is down this much. Obviously, the largest decrease here is at level 9, where you're losing the full 10% attack speed down to, you know, 30% attack speed towards the end game. Again, level 18 is kind of fake, but you're going to fuel this for the vast majority of the game, you know, 2 to 4% less attack speed. Now that matters. This is a slightly bigger impact change than it was in the previous patch for reference. And this is, by the way, with data coming in for players optimizing builds and thus gaining win rate over time. So I looked at like for like builds. I compared Shiv's Stormrazor from before and after the patch, and that build lost about 0.6% win rate. And so if we consider that making him lose 0 to 8.5% attack speed was about 0.6% win rate, making him lose 0 to 10% attack speed much earlier, is going to be a bigger win rate magnitude of around, I'm going to say 1 and change percent win rate. Because again, if you control for build optimizations, you can actually tease out win rate delta of the change. And again, the win rate was about 0.6%. So less than it would be for conventional marksman, but realized too late that AD would not be a traditional marksman and not be as receptive to attack speed reductions as other champions would be. Anyway, the other change is to the actual throughput of E. This is the damage per second of E, using this attack speed as a multiplier, and then acknowledging that E happens every 4 auto attacks, and then saying, okay, well, basically, this attack rate divided by 4 times the damage per hit. What is the total throughput of E as a skill? Obviously, level 1 E is not nerfed very much, but Doran's Blade plus stat shards is very common, so even early on, you're going to get something out of this one. And then, you go on and go on and go on. You go towards, 3.5 items here. And yeah, it is a very meaningful damage decrease on the E here. Now, I ran the math on how much of TF's total damage comes from E, just the E damage itself. If I say that this is about 1.1% of win rate, the attack speed nerf, and then I say, okay, what's the damage per hit going down on E? And I look at what's E as a function of TF's total damage output and acknowledge that E is going down about 20% total damage. And E is about 20% of his total damage. It's 20% of 20% is 4%. And you divide, and you're like, okay, yeah, this is somewhere in the tune of 1-ish% win rate on ADTF. Again, the late levels are fake. Level 14 plus doesn't really happen in bot lane. It happens a little bit more in top lane, but this is gold scaling. The average game goes to 3 items, which is usually around here in the build, not here in the build. So all this to say, even though this math does account for what item 4 would be doing to your champion, that's not a realistic situation. And so you're looking at, this data table here, and this is, about what you're looking at here is 20% damage off of about 1/5 of total damage up as a champion. And we know that damage is not the primary thing that not the only thing that ADTF contributes here. He also contributes vision and roaming and map control, and so and CC. So you discount damage nerfs a little bit even beyond that, and we think this is going to be a little bit over 2% win rate off of ADTF, which will put him 49 in change in bot lane, 49 in change in top lane, and I think for ADTF around 48, 49 in mid. I forget exactly, but regardless, meant to put him into a normal place. Vayne isn't the champion who is doing too well, especially she is skewed toward top lane. Now we intentionally want Tumble to be the primary max because this allows her to have actual gameplay in bot lane. If you have to play W max Vayne in bot lane, you basically don't have room to ever tumble forward and do anything because the damage is so pitiful that just Mystic Shot beats you, and also just someone auto-attacking you often just beats you, and the ability just sucks. But if you enforce that Vayne is meant to Q-max in bot lane, she has a real laning phase and a real trading pattern, and that's better than just sit in lane, hope to die, become a late game god, right? Like, per power level, per win rate, per, power budget of Vayne, having some agency while not being a good laner is better for the champion, better for League of Legends. And so we are basically letting Tumble still be very, very good in lane. But the other thing that Tumble does, though, is actually quite abusive in early laning trades against top laners who can't Mystic Shot you back, can't do anything back, in fact. They are always kept at arm's length because of things like Condemn. And so this basically comes in and says, okay, well, you will still have Tumble as a trading tool, but if you're using Tumble to aggressively will your opponent down, you're going to have far, far, far fewer of them. But if Tumble is an opportunistic trade back, it's likely to be coming back up for you as Vayne in the bot lane. Also, Night Hunter's move speed, and this is, by the way, the non-ulti move speed, so, her team fight power of press R, or, it's level 6's all-in time, that's unchanged. It's really go time, let's go flip the switch. That's unchanged. It's the, I always run faster than you. You're running backwards as Renekton with boots 1, I'm still faster than you. Plus Tumble. And by the way, Tumble's dash speed is 500 plus her total move speed. This actually affects the forward Tumble speed here as well, which, again, I think is not that it doesn't affect bot lane, but it disproportionately affects top lane. So I don't know for sure if these nerfs are going to be enough, but we'll see if people are happy with 51% win rate Vayne or something. If Vayne is 50 in top lane and 51 in bot, I think that's totally fine here. But we're definitely trying to disproportionately nerf Vayne top lane, get her down to around 50, and I think if Vayne is not 52, it's pretty acceptable, but we'll see what people feel like about a 51, Vayne in bot lane. Here, really quickly, is the math on Tumble cooldown. Really obvious kind of math here. And then how much move speed. This is, no boots, boots 1, boots 2. The functional move speed you have compared to before and after. And again, yeah, she's, faster than melee champion with boot speed. Before and a little bit after, but less so aggressively. Maybe not the post boots version, but, yeah, she was really, really fast. We have some Veigar buffs. Veigar is another relatively low mastery required champion, so he tends to observe a high win rate while being balanced in low elo. Veigar has an observed win rate of 50.5% in low elo, which is honestly pretty trash. So pretty simple buffs here. 5% AP ratio increase on Q. One thing that is true here, by the way, is because Death Cap got nerfed in 14.1. Supposed to be called out here because Death Cap got nerfed in 15.1. 14.1. Sorry. This was like a core champ on Veigar, right? Like, it makes sense that Veigar is a Death Cap purchaser. It makes sense that Evelynn's a Death Cap purchaser, right? They have very specific, obvious reasons to want to build Death Cap very aggressively. But that means it was a very direct Veigar nerf because he used the AP multiplier more than any of the champ in the game. And so basically re-adding that for him in the case of, well, here's AP ratio on Q. Worth noting that Q as a damage spell is actually high elo skewed in terms of its percentage of total damage output. So this very, very lightly, I think, works to slightly undo some elo skew. He will still be very aggressively low elo skewed. That's fine. That's not, a surprise or anything that we're necessarily trying to hard fix. But we'll look a little bit nicer in that regard. Are giving him just more access to the button in the first place. You're still going to look very frequently for opportunistic uses of the spell, but a 20-second cooldown at rank 1, a 10-second cooldown increase, or buff, I should say, at rank 2 is pretty meaningful here. And so these are, I think, quite sizable buffs to Veigar the champion. We then have a buff to Vex here. This is basically looking at it and saying, hey, the logic here is, playing up Vex's best matchups is the TLDR, right? Playing up the reasons that you would play Vex. It is a 10 base damage and 5% AP ratio increase on the passive. That is a pretty big deal. I didn't do the math here. Give the math to me is relatively just straightforward. Like, here's what this does. It increases your damage in, fairly obvious ways. This plays her up specifically in matchups where you can use her passive more. So against the dashers, right? Against Yasuo Yone. Vex, when you look at the fact that 5 of her 6 most common mid lane matchups are advantageous, the champion should probably have a pretty inflated win rate. Probably not like 52 necessarily, but like probably about 50.5, I'm pretty sure is reasonable for this champion. And so we think that's going to be the case. And I think she's also relatively easy. And I think this all leads to her having a relatively high resting win rate and that being pretty acceptable. And if Yasuo players are banning Vex, she counters you. That's how that works, in the sense that like Morgana has a forever permanent 30% ban rate because hook champions just always ban Morgana, no matter what her power level is. If Vex is believed to be actually powerful, just that Yasuo players have to actually care, that's fine. That's totally reasonable here. And then, nice QO here. E will now grant the passive refund. Okay, great. We move on to Wukong buffs that are meant to be top lane skewed. When we buffed the range on Q a couple patches ago, it weirdly didn't buff him in top lane almost at all, but it brought up his jungle a ton, to the point where I think Wukong right now is around like a 49.5% win rate, both top laner and jungler. We would still like to go top lane skewed a little bit here. I think Wukong at 50 in jungle is pretty reasonable. I think Wukong at 51 and change in top lane is more appropriate. Wukong tends to be, I think, a little bit low elo skewed. He's primarily just a very, very low master requirement champion. Like, yes, Decoy has like optimizations, and yes, there's like some animation cancels in that Q cancels into literally everything because every spell in his kit is instant cast, and instant cast spells can be cast during uncancelable auto attacks. That's a mouthful. Because instant cast spells can be cast during uncancelable auto attacks, Wukong Q cancels into every button on his kit. So there are optimizations, but there's not very hard. It's just, learn to press the 2-button combo, right? Ultimately, Wukong has a relatively flat mastery curve. Relatively flat mastery curve champions tend to deserve high win rates because people aren't inting their win rates by being bad at the champion. So anyway, we are tweaking some stuff that we expect to be top lane skewed. Basically, the passive stacks about twice as fast. The theoretical max stack version of the passive is very, very slightly weaker. But basically, any trade that is between 2 and 9 autos or hits is strictly better. No ifs, ands, or buts. And even the longer trades are better because you're keeping the armor and the health regen. As the stacks fall off, they will now fall off 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 instead of going from 10 to 0. So even the back half will then even further be better. So even like, I guess one stack wouldn't be any different. But anyway, this is all to say that while you are actively trading with somebody, if you hit somebody 3 times, the amount of armor you get is being increased by 50%. Is this massive? Not necessarily a ton. I didn't do the math on like the amount of physical damage mitigation you're getting before and after here. But this 150% will also factor in the health regen, right? So the amount of regen you get from the trade is also being increased by 50%. If you're taking a much longer trade, you're doing E auto Q, and then like maybe you get 2 more autos before you walk away. You scrimp for those like last 2 hits because you're using the E attack speed and the Q armor shred. You're getting 2/3 more out of the armor. So that you went for the e-auto Q, but then you got your 5-6 extra armor for the trade. But then you also said, well, now that I had extra armor, I will go ahead and hit harder, and then now I've got my 30 bonus armor for the walk back, and my regen is 60, 2/3 higher as well, and so I can withstand that. And then even beyond that, it's a bit more than 2/3 because the stack fall off will give you a little bit more towards the end there, so you get a little bit more positive power. This might be a ton, right? It's hard for us to know exactly how much power this is, but it's obviously very powerful. It's obviously very meaningful, and it's meant to be top lane skewed because it's the kind of thing where it's going to be meaningful. This will give him some power in the jungle, especially the fall off thing, because it's going to be very easy now for Wukong to have some stacks going from wolves to raptors if you weren't good at kiting the camp. So if you weren't really good at optimizing the clear and keeping stacks up, it's going to be even nicer here as well. We're then doing a tweak to Yorick. This is primarily around the R just having kind of bad rules. And then additionally, kind of just as its own thing, there is a nerf to the E strictly by itself. So Maiden inherited the Ghoul AoE damage reduction. What's weird is the tooltip says that Maiden also takes half damage from monsters. Yorick's passive tooltip says that Yorick's summons take half damage from AoE and take less damage from monsters. I think it's half. I forget exactly what it is. Maiden has never taken less damage from monsters. She, however, does take 70% less damage from lane minions. That was not said anywhere, so now it's in the tooltip. But she did inherit the AoE damage reduction. However, Maiden is a tanky, ranged permanent companion. She does not need to be skewed against Crowstorm. She is not Tibbers. She is not Daisy. She is not in melee range. She's frequently not going to be running into the range of Crowstorm. She's not going to be getting hit by, generic, Renekton buttons. She's not going to get, generically hit by, Jinx rockets or whatever. This is just not how it works. However, she does have to go fight Jax in lane sometimes. And because just her numbers were her numbers, she was tuned to be a spot where she was basically invisible to Aatrox and paper to Jax. I would like if Maiden just had a normal health bar, because I don't think she needs the AoE damage reduction rules, because they don't make sense for Maiden. But she also shouldn't be made of paper when Jax auto-attacks her a whole bunch. So, there's also a bug fix where Yorick's auto-attack damages weren't respecting Shen W, and so now they do. But blind, dodge, and evasion all work appropriately, so hey, by the way, these are all fine, but this is the one that I looked for, and yeah, now Yorick ult auto-attack interaction asks for Shen W, and if it is, it doesn't deal the damage. Okay, let's talk about the numbers there and what that means. So because Maiden is going from 10 to 50 armor to 30 to 90 armor, which matches all the other big permanent minions like Daisy and Tibbers, the health bar is now more equivalent, looks more like and acts more like a champion health bar or a large pet health bar. That they're all consistent on purpose so that you can kind of learn them all together, that you interact with them in a similar way that you interact with champions. I'll also say that this is against single target damage if you're taking turret shots, if you're getting hit by Baron, if you're getting hit by Jinx with some auto attacks. Here is the effective health before and the effective health after. Yeah, like Maiden was really, really, really made of paper. This is like actually 12 autos, right? Like this is just paper. And now it's going to be, 15 autos, which is not that much better, but it's meaningfully better. And because of just the way that the armor and the MR pays off, it's a much bigger buff once you're sort of like solidly into the mid game around level 8 plus and whatnot. And so, a pretty decent gain here as the armor and the MR stacks up. But also it meant that you are basically invincible. Like tell me what Aatrox combo actually deals 3,700 damage. Like, it's not realistic, right? Like, yeah, Aatrox does a lot of damage, but, like, he doesn't do 3,700 tooltip damage. So it was basically impossible for half the top lane pool to literally do anything because their kit just didn't work because it just dealt half damage to Maiden. 25 damage, 2,500 is still not, really how much damage Aatrox deals. But this is, the tooltip damage you need to kill Maiden afterwards. And so, yes, there are going to be some matchups. They're going to look a lot better into Yorick than before. There's going to be some matchups that look a lot worse in Yorick than before. This, I think, should have been on its own. And then there's also a nerf, just, hey, the amount of damage coming at the E is simply too high. This could have gone harder. I essentially chose to be a little risk averse here. I didn't want to over nerf this champion too badly. Didn't have to really happen, but I chose to go kind of light here. The goal here is about 1% win rate. I think ultimately this puts Yorick's win rates pretty reasonable. He is a low elo skewed champion because the counter to play him is just complex enough to not be obvious to silver players, but is pretty easy for emerald or masters players to deal with. Regardless, a small change there. We move to Zac. Zac is being tweaked Basically, he is too good in top lane. He is fine in the jungle. And so we are buffing rank 1 of W and then nerfing ranks 3 and onwards, which we expect to be relatively power neutral to Zac jungle. Zac top just hard maxes W. Yes, you can go 3 points W to max E, but the vast majority of Zac players don't. And so, look, if you're a challenger Zac one trick and you're like, well, actually, what I do is 3 points W to max E and I'm still sick, hey, good for you. You're an optimizer. Like, you know, you're good at your champion. Okay. But most players play against generic Zac, and the vast majority of players will just play against 5 points W Zac. And that Zac is going to lose 15 damage per spellcast here. So I think this is valuable. This is meaningful. This is admittedly very, very low scope. It's very, very low scope, skewed towards top lane. I don't think this means that Zac is perfectly designed or anything, but this is what this was meant to do. It should be a very simple, very easy to implement light nerf to Zac while keeping Zac jungle in the same spot. And there might be tweaks we have to do at some other point in time with this champion, but that's the change. So we managed to go for 2 hours. That was a very, very, very long patch rundown. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.